Germans shared personal life narratives on panels flanking the academic presentations. In this way, the conferences made possible inclusive, multi-layered conversations and simultaneously encouraged both professional networking and international community development. Importantly, within this space, Black German Americans who, by the way, also vary in terms of their transnational histories and family backgrounds, are intentionally re-inscribing themselves into Black German genealogy, history, and Black Germanness. We are earnestly participating in the vibrant and sometimes controversial conversations in the pioneering interdisciplinary field of Black German studies. We are assembled today at the University of Toronto because we believe this conference will make a significant contribution to ongoing international discourses, and because we are profoundly committed to advancing a positive sense of community among persons who identify as Black Germans, Black people with a significant life experience in Germany and German-speaking countries, and others for whom our shared history and lived experiences are of intimate value. We are delighted to invite Black Canadian voices to join this conversation, and we look forward to hearing from our local presenters about their experiences. We are grateful to each of you for taking the time out of your busy lives to join us. Whether you are speaking, performing, or just listening and observing, your presence in this space at this moment is deeply appreciated. We are especially thankful for our invited keynotes, speaker, filmmaker, and performer Sherry Hagen, Dr. Fatima Al-Taib, Noah So, Dr. Leila Sami, and Oksana Chi. I owe a personal debt of gratitude to many here and others not present whom I consider my chosen family. You know all too well that the BGHRA and our conferences are effectually inseparable from my personal adoption, reunion, and academic journeys. You have steadfastly held me up and encouraged me privately in a myriad of ways over many challenging years. Because of you, I can. For the BGHRA, this conference is very much a family reunion. We feel the absence of those who have been with us in the past who are unable to attend this time. We are indeed an international community, and I invite those of you meeting us for the first time at the University of Toronto to join us. We trust that everyone present will be enriched and inspired by our program, and that these precious few days we have together will create new memories, enjoy fabulous conversations, and have an amazingly wonderful time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Markus Stocker. I'm the chair of the Department of Germanic Languages and Literatures here at the University of Toronto. I would like to welcome you all and thank the Black German Heritage and Research Association for your work and for choosing our university as the venue for this timely and significant meeting. I wish to acknowledge this land on which we are meeting today and which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many indigenous people from across North America, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I am very grateful to Angelica Fenner for having organized this marvelous conference, and I would like to congratulate you for your amazing fundraising. And for those of you who are not Canadian, getting a connection grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada is such a ton of work, and I'm so glad that it worked out, and it's wonderful. And I will not mention all of these sponsors, but if you just look at it, all of this includes a lot of work, legwork, emails, and so on. So that's really wonderful. The resourcefulness and creativity with which you pull these things off is really outstanding. Thank you. I will not bore you with many remarks, but let me just put in a few side words on our department, the Department of Germanic Languages and Literatures, because we're proud that it belongs to one of the oldest German departments on this continent. Indeed, we celebrated our 150th birthday not too long ago. We are older than Canada itself. Today we have 12 faculty members, and while focusing on a recognizable disciplinary core, we are among the most interdisciplinary humanities units at this university, with many of us holding cross appointments in other units, for example, cinema studies, philosophy, and so on. Our ties to CSI, the Cinema Studies Institute, are very strong, and we owe our thanks also to CSI for providing this wonderful space here. So this is not the German department, which is also a very, very beautiful space, but it's on the other side of campus. I wish you a delightful, productive, energetic, and engaged exchange that we needed in this day and age. Is so obvious that I needn't lose any more words about it. I hope you have 3 very productive days, and I hope you'll enjoy our wonderful multicultural city of Toronto. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and greetings again since yesterday evening. I'm assuming everyone here was also at the screening, but for anyone that's new, I'm Angelica Fenner, associate professor here at U of T, and I think I'm just going to rename myself the Whirling Dervish, based on my experience this week as we pull all the disparate strands together for this event to take place. We've had an acknowledgement of the land that we occupy here, and I would also like to say a few words about the space here in this town hall, which has its own distinguished history. It's an important function within the city. The Innistown Hall is the site for innumerable film festivals throughout the year, including Hot Docs. It's one of the venues for Hot Docs, which is an annual documentary festival and the largest in North America. And we also, during the school year on Thursdays and Fridays, we also have a series of educational events for seniors. So you will see this is a very, during the school year, you'll see this is a very multi-generational space occupied both by those starting their studies and those who are sort of coming back to reinvigorate their learning in retirement. The hall itself is equipped for 60mm, 35mm all digital platforms, so it's really state-of-the-art. It was renovated just a couple of years ago after years of fundraising, so as to increase its capacity a little bit more and to update all of the screening platforms. You may or may not be aware that the University of Toronto is based on a college system, so the disciplines are housed in individual colleges, and Innis College is one of those. It's one of the newest colleges, founded in the mid-60s. I'm saying mid-60s because I can't remember if it's 1964 or 1968. In any case, you can see it is a newer architecture that has been sort of grafted onto an older Victorian house, which now houses a cafe and upstairs a few classrooms. So I also want to share a few logistics about the use of the space for you in the next couple of days. First and foremost, the way that we'll be proceeding with the panels, which generally have 2 or 3 speakers, is I know some of you are used to in academic venues having a table and chairs, and you sit at the table and chairs and read your papers and stay there for the duration of your session. We'll be doing things a little bit differently because of the, well, somewhat cavernous size of the space relative to what many of us are used to in smaller sessions. So the moderator will come up to the podium, will introduce the speaker, then the speaker will come up and read their presentation, and then after all the presentations are finished, all speakers will come and sit in the seats and field discussion. At that point, I guess the moderator will also join the presenters. So that's how we'll proceed. A few other details. So lunch will be served across the street here to that's east, across St. George Street. So you'll be crossing and then just bearing a little bit north to enter Innis Residence, which is a dormitory for students of Innis College. And we'll have grad students kind of helping to usher, sort of steer you in that direction. Washrooms, we have accessible washrooms on this floor. They're towards the back of the building, that is to say north. So just sort of bear north through the so-called principal's office. No, I know that sounds like we're back in high school, but there are 2 accessible bathrooms in there at the very back of the building. Just continue as far as you can to the back and you'll see. We have many more actually directly underneath this theater. And there's a stairway that leads down there just on the other side of this wall here, so loop around to those. I think that covers everything. Yeah, so and we have 2 grad students that you probably encountered outside when you were picking up your badges that are prepared to field any questions, any logistical issues that might come up for you as visitors here in the city, whether it's about sightseeing or just about more practical concerns that you might have with printing out your paper or anything like that, please don't hesitate to approach them. So I think that means we are ready to move on to our very first session. We're just running a tiny bit late, but this is actually par for the course with me. Anyone that knows me at all knows that I'm always sort of just arriving breathlessly from somewhere else, and I suspect we'll continue in that vein today. So our first panel then will be moderated by Ronaldo Walcott. So I would like to welcome him to join us. We're very grateful, Ronaldo, for your participation today.
Can you hear me? I was asked to speak into the mic. We were asked to speak into the mic. Okay, so this first session is entitled Framing Oral Histories in Scholarship, Arts, and Activism. And there are going to be 3 papers, I think, yeah. And the first speaker is Sylvia Buchinsky from the University of Lausanne. And let me read Sylvia's bio. So, born and raised in Frankfurt, Germany, Sylvia is a research assistant and PhD candidate in the field of anthropology of travel and tourism at the Institute of Geography and Sustainability, University of Lausanne, since 2016. After her master's in anthropology, University of Vienna, she worked as a research assistant at the Medical University of Vienna Department of Ethnomedicine and International Health from 2012 to 2015, and mainly worked with international migration of health workers. Her PhD project explores the relationship between transnational mobility and afro-German identities. For her research, she accompanies participants during their travels, and she does biographical interviews to complete this lived experience of traveling together. Her paper this morning is entitled Afro-German, Afropean, Afropolitan, the relation between travel and the practice and narration of diasporic selves. Sylvia? And I hope I got your last name correctly. Thank you.
So hi everyone, and thank you very much for organizing this conference. I'm really, really glad to be here, and especially to hear all of your talks after that one. So in my work, I am interested in the relation between travel and identity, travel and the construction of self. The research is based in the field of anthropology of travel and tourism, and aims to understand how socially and culturally constructed categories and hegemonic narratives of identity, for example of national identity, are negotiated, challenged, and transgressed by practices and narratives of mobility in connection with an Afro-diasporic identity in Germany. My departure point is that collective histories, identities, and diasporic consciousness are created through individual narratives as well as through practices. the practice of connecting with other diasporic cultural and political networks and people on a global level, like here today. In order to understand constructions of Afro-diasporic identities and the place that diverse forms of transnational mobility have in the lives of people of African descent in Germany today, I'm doing life story interviews. For my own empirical research, I work with 7 people for whom an Afro-diasporic and Afro-German identity is important for their understanding of self, and I focus on their life stories, on how they choose to narrate their lives, with a particular interest in the role of travel and mobility and how they negotiate belonging over space and time. Through narrated life stories, different times and places one person lives in, and the diverse people that matter or mattered in a life are related to each other in linear and non-linear ways. In their article on improvising and navigating mobilities in 2017, Amit and Knowles introduced the reader to the concept of spatial biography as a way to narrate a person's life, focusing on mobility in it. I use this concept in my research too. Here at that presentation, I choose to present to you only one of these spatial biographies from Oksana Chi, because for one, she's here and you can meet her at the conference, and also because her story fits well into the other 2 biographies that I will present briefly, the biographies of Ika Hügel-Marschall and Mai Ayim. They all 3 considered themselves as political activists and artists, which is an important part of their understanding of self. So what I want to do here today is, first, I want to shed light on the importance of travel in the autobiographical writings of Mai Ayim and Ika Hügel-Marschall, and I want to link them to the biography of Oksana Chi, also an Afro-German artist that I work with empirically. By linking these very diverse and complex biographies, the aim is to contribute to an understanding of Afro-German identities in a larger context that do not only differ over space, place, and time, but that also differ over personal biographies, histories, or professional choices. But all of these very personal histories are also part of more collective histories of Black diasporic movements to and from Germany. So the narration of personal life experiences plays an essential part in the construction of Afro-German activism since the 1980s movement. Within these narrations, the quest for Black, African, or Afro-American roots and origins in a double sense hold a special place. First, the individual's quest for Black family origins outside Germany, and second, a collective quest for a shared history of African and Black presence in Germany. Ika Hügel-Marschall and Mai Ayim are related to an African or Ghanaian and Black US American diaspora in Germany born in 1945 and 1960, and to whom destinations like Ghana, the Caribbean, and the US are important because of unknown family history, as well as a desire to reconnect with one's own sense of Blackness, which is self-defined and not imposed from the outside. So how do Ika Hügel-Marschall or Mai Ayim include the places visited and the people met in the narratives of their own lives? In her book, in her autobiography, Daheim unterwegs, Ika Hügel-Marschall describes how through the connection with other Afro-Germans she was able for the first time to forge a very self-confident form of belonging in Germany because she could identify with other Afro-Germans. In this group, she felt for the first time that it was normal to be German and Black. In the second half of her book, Ika Hügel describes her travels to the US and to the Caribbean and how these affected her sense of self and her sense of belonging. In the US, where she was at the age of 46, finally able to meet her father and family. She describes the experience of meeting her father and his family in Chicago as the end of her journey, I quote, in a poem, and I quote it. I reach out my hand, reach out to my Black family, my father, my family. Here at the end of my journey, here the whole world flows together. And the second important travel that she mentions in her life is the travel to St. Croix, to the Caribbean, to meet Audre Lorde and her partner, where she experienced for the first time in her life being in a place where being Black was the norm. The place and its people transmit to her a feeling of being one amongst many others. A feeling she does not know like this from Germany. Here on the Caribbean island, she feels safe from negative racial discrimination. It will become a place that she will travel to every year. And for Mai Ayim, amongst many other travels that she made, Ghana and South Africa hold a special place. They are mentioned in her essay collection, Grenzenlos und Unverschämt, that also exists in English, I believe, a posthum publication of 1997. So in 1986, Mai Ayim goes to Ghana for a few months. The motive of a quest for family origins becomes only discreetly apparent in her travel. Ghana is a place for Mai Ayim that she associates with an unknown family history. She associates Ghana until then only with her father, to whom she has a difficult relationship. The travel is supposed to give her another sense of the country, beyond that of her father. She decides to take part in a development project to be able to be in more intensive contact with people from Ghana, a contact that goes beyond the consuming tourist. She will meet her grandfather there for the first time, the father of her father, and the fact that he will accept her without condition as family member will be something she remembers forever. And she writes, "Here I was, standing in front of my grandfather. He was 80 years old, I was 26. When I entered his house, he came to me with open arms and hugged me, as if I was his most beloved granddaughter." In 1991, Mai Ayim travels to South Africa for research and studies. She has worked in an anti-apartheid movement for many years by then. On a festival in South Africa, Johannesburg, she recites the poem Afro-Deutsch about her experiences in Germany. She shares her feelings and experiences about the unification and growing racist attacks in the 90s. The political perspective of blackness in South Africa that she was not able to find like that in Germany until now was very appealing for her. The more politically defined category of being a black community based on shared experiences of marginalization, racial discrimination, and othering, came close to what Mai Ayim had in mind for her life and work in Germany. She translated her experiences abroad in the anti-apartheid movement in Berlin into her role as a founding member of the Black German movement. The travel and the ongoing connection with South Africa allowed Mai Ayim to create a self-understanding as black activist and to renegotiate her understanding of black as a politically active global community of Afro-descendant people. So the life story narratives of the two Afro-German authors are an example of the understanding of selfhood as embedded in social, political, and historical environments, and the entanglement and development of self with others. Both had to very actively create and search for role models and positive images of blackness, of Africanness in and outside Germany, to create a rootedness in a diasporic self as African, Ghanaian, Afro-American, and German. The stories also show how important mobility and changing places can be for perceiving the self. So another biography that I want to talk about today is Oksana Cheese. Oksana is also here together with her partner Laila Sami, and tonight they will perform. And they are also the reason that I can be here today in the first place, because I met them in New York and then we traveled together to Toronto to this conference. And they told me about this conference also. Oksana is a dancer, artist, and Afrofeminist activist with East Nigerian, East European origins. When I met her for the first time at a conference on the theme of Afro-Europeans in Finland in 2016, I went to talk to her and Laila after their performance and told her about my project to work on travel and identity. She seemed to like the idea because traveling was an inherently essential part of her life. We met again in November 2017, this time in Berlin, where Oksana and Laila lived. Sitting in an Italian restaurant over lunch in Schöneberg, where Oksana also holds a studio place for dance practice, Oksana tells me about her life recounted over the different travel experiences she made in her life. Travels in over 40 countries on all continents. She does not have the time to tell me about all of them this day, but there are several travels in her narration and all hold a special place in her life. They all add up to form her body memory, as she calls it, and they are also all included in her performative style as dancer and artist in one way or another. So what I want to do now is to focus on only two of them to show how these places she traveled to had an impact on her life and self. For Oksana, travel has always been the norm. When she speaks about herself growing up, travel is part of it. First on a small scale as a child, then as a teenager already more in Europe, and then enlarging it to the world. Traveling was always in relation to certain people and to her activity as a dancer. They go together. And I quote her, "So I always went to the Black Forest and Switzerland, often on my own when I was 10 or so. And therefore this being mobile, traveling, going somewhere, anywhere, at first within Germany and Switzerland, and then when I was a little more independent with 15 or 16, it extended to Europe. Back then I never traveled alone, always with friends or acquaintances, and then later I began traveling to the US with 20, US, India, and then Asia. In order to follow her passion for theater and dancing and her thirst for culture, staying in a place like Bochum, where she went to school, was not enough. In a dance theater with 17, she met people from all over the world. With about 17, I lived in a dance theater, she says. In one room, there was a pianist from the Caribbean and a few dancers from France. That was in Düsseldorf. From Bochum, I went to Dortmund and to Düsseldorf. I moved a bit, because everything was too narrow. Yes, it's important to note that things easily get too narrow for me. Bochum was quickly too small, and I didn't know what to do in such an industrial city, especially regarding the cultural program. The theaters were not my cup of tea, and I already knew that I wanted to do something with theater when I was 14 years old. The dance theater belonged to an Afro-American artist in Düsseldorf, a city which had a bigger theater scene. Already in her life in Germany, transnational contacts played a major role for her personal and professional development. I moved in this dance theater, she says, that belonged to an Afro-American, and there I met many international people because he always had scholarships and funding. So there were always artists from France, and all kinds of people lived there and produced pieces with him. After that, she went to Folkwang-Schule, the artistic school in Essen, in the Ruhr area, where she learned modern and classical ballet, but soon that was also too narrow, as she explains, too German for her, whose development has always been influenced internationally. So again, that was too narrow, she says. With their focus on classical ballet, and the modern classes were not for me either. But I have to say that I had already trained with international artists, and then to be again in such a German education. And well, I thought it was weird to hear from the teachers, and now forget everything you learned until here, although I had just learned so much from an Afro-American artist. And then they stand before me and tell me to forget everything and to do their movements that are maybe not fit to my body because I am also Afro, you know? And I was eager to learn. I told them I love German Ausdruckstanz and also appreciate ballet a lot. I want to learn it, but I also want to keep what I learned so far. It wasn't international enough for me. There were a few foreigners, but as I said, it was very German boring, but German in the sense of boring. And I didn't like it. I wanted something modern. I wanted to develop in direction to the future, not directed towards the past. I believe what Oksana's words tell us here, when she uses words such as modern or boring, it relates to the fact that the dominant narrative of Germany likes to consider itself as culturally homogeneous, not taking into account the various international influences that always existed and shaped Germany since forever. In the US, for example, it's a normality that international influences shape the country in many ways. This is also the case in Germany, but the dominant narrative still holds on to an essentialist view of the nation state that is based on the idea of a cultural, linguistic, or racial community, as Brubaker analyzes. Oksana has discovered the power of traveling, a sort of coming of age, during her first travel and road trip to India, after being a dance student for many years in Essen and Düsseldorf. This travel was like an eye-opening moment in her life. Oksana associated her travel to India to learning process, learning how to travel and to not be afraid. So I stayed with that opera singer, she said, from Cologne. She was an Aussteigerin, a person who opts out of society, and who was in Kerala to study Kathak dance and chant. And how did you meet her? Well, I always meet people. I just talked to her one day and asked her if she was German. I could see that she was. Really? Yes, I just had to ask her. And then we became friends. I told her I was a dancer, that I was from Germany, and that my sister also sang. So that was the first time that I made such a huge travel. And this first travel was kind of an eye-opening. A lot of crazy things happened. And after that travel, it was clear to me, now I have such a power. Now I can travel everywhere. After that travel, she moved to Berlin, also an important place in her life and work. That travel to India marked her life and career. That is where she began to learn dance and performance from all over the world that she would include in her own style. The medium of dancing was always something that brought her closer to the people in the countries she traveled to. She returned to India 2 years ago. That's the second travel. Almost 30 years after her first travel there. Now, to not learn anymore, as she said, but to perform. With Laila, they performed I Step on Air, the dance piece that they will also show here. A dance piece dedicated to Mai Ayim, the Afro-German poet and iconic figure of the Afro-German feminist movement of the 1980s. They performed on a queer theater and dance festival in Delhi. This showing of her piece, that she choreographed from her own perspective, with her background, her socialization in Germany as an Afro-German artist who deals creatively with the life of Mai Ayim, created new connections. During our interview in Berlin, at a later point, I asked her again about the performance I Step on Air in Delhi. I asked her, when you told me that you had shown I Step on Air in Delhi, you told me that it was interesting for you that they organized it into ragas, which means, as I understood, different moods and emotional states. And that for you, your socialization in Germany also played a role in how you conceived the piece? Yes, exactly, she said. Because I Step on Air is dedicated to Mai Ayim, and Mai Ayim did a lot here in the academic realm in Berlin. Mai Ayim was an activist, an artist, a researcher, and for many also a spiritual person to look up to, who gives you input. Unfortunately, she died early, and since then there are initiatives to remember her with different projects. I dealt a lot with Mai's biography, but even more with her poems, when she travels to Ghana. I Step on Air is dedicated to Mai Ayim, but it's also dedicated to traveling, how she comes back, how you are in different worlds, how you go from one world to another and experience things. So the feedback that she got from the people she met in India and Delhi that time enabled a more global vision of her piece. And that is, as she says, what she likes most, experiencing how things are seen and interpreted in other countries and places and by other people with different backgrounds, how the pieces are interpreted with other frames of reference, cultural references at hand, but that still make sense. In I Step on Air, that also includes a political message for the rights of people of color in Germany, Oksana talks about the ways that the struggles in Germany can be linked to different but comparable struggles in India. As she, Mai Ayim, was a political person, the piece is also about politics, how we are invited and then outvited again, as people that are binational, but also how to use the strengths from both worlds and to connect them, but also how to use the strengths to connect them, how we get in and outvited, and how people make promises to us, and then we think, now we go forward. And then again, we realize it's on hold. And I asked her, with we, do you mean binational or we? With we, I mean in this context from Mai Ayim, the Afro-German movement or the POC movement in Germany. Together they try to reach a bigger audience for people with migration backgrounds and for things to get more modern, that it's not always the same people that decide everything. And that is all included in I Step on Air. And I think they do understand that in Delhi, because they do have a lot of class struggles, and they had the caste system, and there are a lot of migrants in Delhi because there are many who come north to work. They understood that piece well. So that's only a tiny glimpse of the travels that Oksana made and that were important for herself and also for her development as an Afro-German artist. Traveling and living in diverse places around the world is intimately linked to her understanding of self as mobile. Mobile in the sense of existential as well as geographical mobility. This mobility also produces a sense of homeliness that is detached from geography and which is deeply rooted in an understanding of being able to create home wherever she goes, through activity, dancing, and with her partner Laila. Transnational travel has become a condition to build and practice community in a double sense, experiencing a globally entangled Afro-diasporic and feminist community, as well as relating to and building a global network with dancers, performers, and researchers. Thank you very much for your attention.
Our second speaker is Daniel Williams. Daniel is assistant professor in the Department of Sociology, as well as co-director of the Critical Studies of Race and Ethnicity program at St. Catherine University in Minnesota, USA. His main interest is in the relationship between race and national identity in global and comparative perspective, with a focus on Europe, the USA, and Latin America. He has done ethnographic research on integration courses in Germany, as well as on the second generation in citizenship. His current work focuses on colorblindness discourse in the European context, global and transnational blackness, and transformations in racial classifications and identities in the US. His paper is entitled Constructing Black German Identities Through Local, National, and Global Blackness, Germany from a North American Perspective. Daniel?
Good morning. I'm delighted to be here with so many new faces and so many possibilities for learning from each other about thinking about blackness in a global and national and German perspective. Wait until this. So I'm going to talk today about some research I've conducted in Germany last year, interviews with several individuals who identify as Black German, and I guess in true academic style, I've changed the title of my presentation somewhat. And first of all, I had to remember where I was, and that is in Canada, not in the United States. So I've changed my title from North American to US. Suitably. I have a lot to learn here today about, I look forward to the panel on Black Canadian experiences, and we have, I think, a lot to discuss about these differences. And the main focus that I have today is on the difference between the national and the global, and national and global blacknesses. Okay. So my question and my interest today is in thinking about blackness racial categories in the color line as national versus global constructions. It comes out of a comparative perspective that I've been working on, which obviously has taught us that blackness is not the same across national boundaries. At least state ideologies of blackness are not always the same. For instance, in the US, we've had an explicit system of racial classification and categorization, beginning with slavery and following with numerous things such as the US Census, which clearly categorized Black people as Black. And unlike Latin American countries where there has been a state ideology of mestizaje or mixed race state ideology that has co-opted and included in a very problematic way Black people and Blackness in its national identity. Why is this important? I want to explore this as a basis for how the interviewees that I talk to narrate their sense of being Black and how the state categories may influence how people talk their way into and out of being Black German or being Black in a global sense or Black in some other sense other than that. And in my discipline, sociology, a lot of discussion has been around what is taking place in the US, which is evolving, according to some scholars, namely Eduardo Bonilla Silva, from a biracial to a triracial stratification system. A very technical term, perhaps, but the point that I think that argument is making is that the US is becoming increasingly like Latin America, where there is an intermediate group of people who would identify as neither quite Black and neither quite white. And there's a whole set of questions that are brought up by that question. So the interviews that I conducted with 7 individuals, which I'll highlight today, I wanted to first of all understand how they understood Blackness. How did their Blackness matter in their everyday lives in Germany or Austria, as one of my informants is from Austria. But I also thought that there's much here that reveals something about Germany more than about the individuals themselves. And so I'm not trying to make a choice about sort of which is more important. But I think that when we look at how people narrate their senses of blackness, we learn a lot about what the state has, how the state has defined blackness, and then the strategies, the strategic narratives that they construct in order to deal with that. And what another thing that comes out of these interviews is the way that gender intersects with race, and I'll talk about how that specifically took place. So in this moment, global blackness has become once again prominent, most clearly in the growing Black Lives Matter movement, which we see is almost ubiquitous around the world. We see Black Lives Matter Paris, Black Lives Matter London, Black Lives Matter Berlin, and I think there's a lot to say about that. So my question is about the tension between these two kinds of blackness, if you will, right? That there's a global discourse on blackness that might presume a commonality across different nation states, right, or homogeneity, right? And then there's the national black narratives that can be quite distinct, but there's also quite a bit to discuss there about the political implications of those two perspectives. The categorizations have consequences for how people narrate their senses of self, but they also have consequences, as noted by scholars of social movements. So if we look at Brazil, for instance, the black movement in Brazil's highest task, one of their most difficult tasks, is to actually convince brown people that they're more like black people than they are like white people, right? So in other words, it's the constitution of people who are already black by another national standard into being black people that is part of the task of the movement itself. So, and that, I would say, is a direct consequence of Brazil's myth of racial democracy that has created that ideology that says that there are brown people and there are black people and they're quite different. So this is important for thinking about how people construct black identities and what those, and that in turn has influence on when thinking about black social movements. So let me jump in with perhaps the thing that is the most obvious that comes out of these interviews, and that is the question of Germanness. In pursuing this project, I was more interested, or these short set of interviews, I was more interested in blackness, but in fact it ends up shedding a great deal more light on Germanness, and it's difficult to talk about those two things separately in this context. So, but these are three examples of interviews of individuals who I asked in terms of how do they identify themselves or how do they experience their blackness in everyday life. And Jay's statement, which I'll read part of, says, essentially, really references the question, what I'm coming to call the question, where are you from, right? There's no other way to say this, and I'm almost apologizing for boring you with that point, because it's so much a part of the Black German experience from what I've witnessed, right, is to be asked the question, where are you from? As I've titled my paper, from a US perspective, right, when we ask the question, well, how do we make sense of that question from a US perspective? I think one of the answers is to say that that question seldom is asked of African Americans, because people know where African Americans are from in the bigger sense of things, right? If we think about that question as a reference for thinking about people being from somewhere, that question is almost never asked of African Americans, almost never. But it is asked of Asian Americans. It is the Asian American question. And Mia Tuan and other scholars have called this the problem of the forever foreigner, right, of Asians in the United States, Asian Americans in the United States. And not surprisingly, Asians are arguably the group that occupied exactly the position that non-whites in Germany have occupied of being excluded from citizenship and nationality, right? So when we look at Asian Americans in immigration history in the US, they are essentially the group that is most targeted for exclusion from immigration, right? Between 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act, in 1943, and actually kept out of citizenship as nationality, not necessarily rights. And so the question of the assumption of foreignness on the part of Asians makes sense and grafts onto the German narrative of foreigners as being non-whites, even though this question and the exclusion of black Germans from citizenship has been, I think, quite different than it has for Turkish or Arab or other minorities in Germany. So, and of course, the notion that Germany is a raceless state, where does it fit into this idea, into these schemes of racial categorizations? It's right in line with the continental European practice of not collecting data on race, right? Of adopting a color blindness approach that is very much along the lines of what Latin American countries does, except that it does it through invisibility rather than through co-optation, right? So rather than saying that there's, oh yes, we're all black, right? In Brazil, people will say, well, I'm this and I'm that and I'm this. I'm a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And people who have a black grandfather will say that they're white on the Brazilian census, whereas in Europe, France, Germany, and other Central and Western European countries do not collect data on race, and England is a notable exception there. The UK is an exception there. So what are the consequences of that? Well, it's obvious that race is real, no question. That's almost an unnecessary statement, and its ubiquity and importance in locating individuals is attested to by Jay's statement, who says that this is the question she's always asked: where are you from? And more importantly, it references the sort of importance of getting this racial information from people in our otherwise meaningless interactions, right? So this is always the question, she says, even before somebody knows me, even before they know what I do, it's, right, they are asking me where I'm from before they even ask what I do, right? So the idea is much like Omi and Winant in racial formation, that one of the first things we want to know about someone is their race, right? And if it's not clear that I've not said that, I think the origin question is the race question in Germany. Asking the question, where are you from, is akin to asking someone what their race is. The second person here, who is Austrian, a woman, A, who identifies A, says, I identify myself as African because I don't feel at home in Austria where I am from, right? She does not feel at home where she is from. I don't feel at home. It's nice there, you're socially secure, but the feeling of being at home, I more have in Nigeria. Both of her parents are Nigerian. So. And finally, S, who's a man in his late 30s, said, I'm German, not because I want to be, but because I am born here, have a German passport, and my life is centered here. So I think both of these statements reflect something important about Germanness, right? On the one hand, we have with A, this identification not with Austria, despite her having grown up in Austria, and even talking about this second generation experience of being taken to parents' parties, right? Having the immigrant kid experience of being dragged to various, ethnic events and then being bored and uninterested, right? And with not that many trips to Nigeria. So, I mean, if we question the transnational position, we might find that she's actually not that transnational, right? But she still identifies more as Nigerian than as German. And S, who I think articulates another very common, or reveals a very common strategy of identification for Germans of color, and that is to define Germanness as this technical thing, right? That I have the passport, I was born here, the center of my life is here, mein Lebensmittelpunkt ist da, that's what he said. I don't know how to translate, maybe you guys can help me with that. But, so this idea of not claiming a black Germanness, right? But claiming a Germanness based on a lot of technical definitions that are not in anything but the passport itself. So I'll come back to this last quote, but I want to move on to a couple of other things. Okay, one of the things that I had not expected but should have, and in the interviews, was the reference, the way that race was embodied, right? The way that people talked about race as inhering in their bodies, and how that was the way in which they actually recognized their otherness within German context. So A, who is, again, the woman from Austria, talks about her being in high school, or the high school age, teenage years, saying, I had a toned athletic build. I was muscular and had a nice figure. But I always got the message that I was too fat, you know, while my super skinny classmates who were white with no muscles, extremely thin, were the beauty standard. And it's still that way. I had problems with my bodily self-image and my figure, and when I look at photos from that time, I think, wow, you had a great body. But as a girl, I went on soup and cabbage diets. You're too fat, or my nose was too big, or, and this she emphasized, my voice was too loud. My voice was too loud. And at some point, I started to speak more softly, like those white girls. I was stunned by the resonance of this with what we know about the black women's experience in the United States, right? These kinds of ideas of the black female body as too masculine, as muscular, right? Of black women as too fat, right, or fat, and particularly the idea of black women as loud, right? This is sort of or black people as loud, which is, of course, very common in the U.S. Experience. And as Joy Lay talks about, you know, those loud black girls and those quiet Asian boys, right? This is the kind of gendered and racialized way of looking at both girls and boys, and she really described what we could say is clearly a global construction of blackness here, right? That this is a way in which the black body is seen globally, not in any different way in the German context. And Jay talked about this as well with the same kinds of standards, right? I had my girlfriends in school and they could curl their hair and it was so easy. I couldn't wear their hairstyles. I didn't have straight hair. I didn't have the body type, right? So again, we see that the body is a very important site for constructing a sense of belonging. And I think that theoretically it raises a question of whether there's a possibility of having a German body as a black person, right? Or what it means to be the kind of black person who can be accepted through embodiment that is typically, or is understood as typically white. That's something maybe we can discuss or revisit. What I think this looks like from the US perspective is that I think that there has been a history of, obviously there's been a history of degrading the black body, sexualizing, objectifying, and otherizing the black body. At the same time, there's a counter discourse of black bodies that goes back quite a ways that also inverts the relationship or the hierarchy between black and white bodies. Some of it is quite problematic, but if we look at the narratives of the black or the berry, for instance, right? Or if we look at the way that, you know, the song Doin' de Butt, which really was a way of reclaiming the black body in a positive comical sense, right? We're talking about an inverting of this notion of black beauty and white beauty, right? And of course, the whole, the Afro in the 1960s and black is beautiful, all of these ways of dealing with this degradation provide tools in the toolkit of black people, right, to actually potentially construct a different sense of self. What I thought stood out here was that both of these women initially compared themselves to their white German peers, that they didn't compare themselves to black German peers, at least not in these contexts they didn't, right? That was the first go-to for them. And I think there is research that shows that, in fact, black girls in the United States have higher self-esteem than white girls do, surprising to many, but in fact, I think that's something to think about in relation to these counter representations of black bodies. Another thing that I found was that many of these, or a couple of these informants or interviewees claimed blackness, they reclaimed blackness in some ways through global connections, right? That they moved out of. And A here, who's the same woman who talked about being too loud and too fat, talked about how she went through a period of feeling depressed in high school, and that what brought her out of that were black authors, black American authors. James Baldwin, Alice Walker, Alex Haley. I read them all. She said that in English. The first part was in German. I, of course, read the classics too, like Charles Dickens. I read everything. But after a while, I had to follow my gut and read black authors, and the only black authors we had access to were American. I devoured it all, the history of slavery and everything else. It devastated me, but it also showed me the racism I have to deal with daily comes from somewhere, and it's not my fault that I'm treated a certain way or not, you know? And then G, who was also had an interesting narrative about calling herself Mischling, which is a term that has roots that other people in this room can talk much more eloquently about than I can. But she says about this term, which is considered derogatory by many and a way of talking about oneself as mixed. I never called myself Mischling before because the word had negative associations. But then after spending time online, watching YouTube videos in English, and everyone was calling themselves mixed, I just translated that back to German. So she adopted this. She just called herself Mischling, thinking of it as the way people talk about mixed race or being mixed race in the US. I think I just have one more here, and there's a couple of other points, but I did try to do my best here with the translation. But another thing that I think was really interesting and is a question that I've seen come up in the scholarship on race, thinking about race in Germany and race in Europe, is where is the color line? And it's one of my initial concerns as I set out. Where is the color line in Germany in a context where perhaps 50% of those who are considered, of migration background are, from a US perspective, would be considered white, right? Russian, Serbian, Eastern European. Where does the color line fall in the German context? And it was noted by two of these people that really the line is between those who are European and those who are not. So as A says here, hey, as a black person, you can't just take off your skin color when you go out. For others, like if you had a Serbian who's blonde and blue-eyed, she can go out and she doesn't have to speak Serbian, right? She just needs to speak German and the Austrians will see her as one of theirs, right? So, and one other person talked about this in a very interesting way that I think will be my last point in terms of thinking about how race is constructed in the German context. She talked about the social separation, right? Social space and how people enter spaces with strangers, right? She says it's really noticeable when strangers meet, then migrants form a group and the bio-Germans, which we can talk about, form a group. Even when the migrant group is mixed, but somehow when you walk into a room and have the choice, migrants go to migrants, and suddenly Turks and black people are friends, So she also talked about her own friendship circles being made up of Germans of color, and that in the course of talking about that, she mentioned Muslims, which is very interesting in terms of thinking about the ways that these different categories in fact overlap or are thought of as being essentially replaceable for one another. So in conclusion, I think there's a lot here that I'm still working on and thinking through, but I think that what much of this shows is there's a couple of thoughts I have on it. One is that, of course, global blackness is a way out of the lack of recognition of oneself within the nation state, although I'm quite sure that there are many counter-black German identities that I'm still unfamiliar with that would be constructed. The state is not the ultimate determiner of one's identity, but it is an important determinant in it. So I look forward to discussing more, and thank you very much.
And our final presenter is Karina Griffith. Karina is a PhD candidate here at the University of Toronto Cinema Studies Institute, where her research on Black authorship in German cinema interacts with theories of affect, intersectionality, and creolization. Her films, installations, and curatorial practice explore the themes of fear and fantasy, often focusing on how they relate to belonging. In 2017, she curated a 3-month-long festival, Republic Repair, 10 Points, 10 Demands, 1 Festival of Repertory Imaginings from Black Berlin at the Post-Migrant Theater Ballhaus. I'm not going to say the last part because that's going to be difficult for me. Her writing can be found in Women in German Studies special online section on race and inclusivity, Berlin Art Link, and Shadow and Act. Karina is currently the district studio grant holder for the project Decolonizing 68 in Berlin, and Karina's paper is entitled What is Producing for Us? Karina?
Hello, everyone, and thank you. I'm one of the co-organizers of this festival. Still, I would like to thank my co-organizers, because I must agree with everything that was said before. It is quite a lot of work to put this together, and especially to Angelika Fenner, it's just been a pleasure to work alongside you and for you, and to have you as a mentor. Okay, so an opportunity presented itself to present, and after hearing these two last presentations, I'm really glad that I took it up. So what I'll be sharing with you today is sort of part of the introduction of my dissertation on Black authorship in German cinema, affect and mobility. There's quite a few intersections with what we've heard before. And here is the much needed subtitle: What is producing for us? Black German film producing against the machine. So, on July 5th, 2017, Black Austrian author and producer Tyrone Ricketts posted an open letter on his Facebook page announcing his return to Berlin after 5 years working in the United States with Harry Belafonte. Der neue deutsche Film, oder wie das Pferd von der Maschine ersetzt würde, translation, the new German film, or how the horse is replaced by the machine, is Ricketts' survey of the German film and television industry. Ricketts, who has starred in Knack Attack and the series Soko Leipzig, takes the position of an engaged observer, calling for structural change, pointing to digital networks as the way forward, and highlighting the work of colleagues who stand ready to take on a bigger role on German screens. So this paper explores the similarities between Ricketts' essay and Med Hondo's 1979 manifesto, What is Cinema for Us? Hence the title, published in Framework, a British film theory magazine covering third cinema. In common with Ricketts, Hondo is an actor as well as a filmmaker. Born in the North African country of Mauritania, Med Hondo started his film career as a voiceover artist, most famously the French voice for Eddie Murphy and Morgan Freeman. In 1966, he started the theater group Shango, and the influences of the stage aesthetic can be seen in the mise en scène of his seminal debut film Soleil Haut, and most prominently in West Indies, The Fugitive Slaves of Liberty. At the time of its making in 1979, West Indies was Africa's most expensive film with a budget of $1.3 million US. So both Ricketts and Hondo's essays point out that the measures that deem whether a film production is successful are stacked against the Black auteur. This paper investigates what is at stake when we compare the situation for Black filmmakers in Germany to that of African filmmakers in the years after colonialism. According to Distastis, which is the Federal Statistic Office, there are approximately 740,000 people with African descent living in Germany. So, is the German funding model a neo-colonial system in terms of image production? How are Black filmmakers in Germany making films in spite of this, and what is producing for us? Hondo calls the African viewers of European cinema on the continent co-producers of European films and the miserable state of Black cinema. He states that multinational film companies at the time were earning 50% of their profits from distribution in the global South. In his view, African spectators were supporting a type of colonial extraction. Quote, each year, millions of dollars are harvested from our continents, taken back to the original countries, and then used to produce new films, which again come to our screens, end quote. So Ricketts didn't make the jump between television to film in his essay, but the two are very much linked. Film funding in Germany is tied to television contracts. In 2011, more than half of the feature films in Germany had a TV partner as part of their financing. Some state and federal film subsidies receive contributions from the broadcasters as well. The Arbeitsgemeinschaft Fernseh Filmforschung, AGF from now on, is a partnership of the TV stations ARD, Pro7 Sat.1, RTL Media Group Germany, and ZDF. These television broadcasters in Germany rely on ratings to determine their investments. So since 1985, the AGF commissions the international marketing research company GfK to monitor the daily television habits of a sample of 5,000 households in Germany. So until 2016, the criteria for participating in this 5,000 household sample was German or EU citizenship. But now, focus group members can have any citizenship, but the main earner in the household must be German speaking. Tyrone Ricketts takes issue with this in his essay. And I see I have the same impulse as my colleagues Sylvia and Danielle to provide you with long quotes. I think I really want his voice to speak. So I'm gonna read my translation. Usually, the first device in the house is measured, not what maybe the partner in the bedroom or the offsprings in their rooms watch. Not included are households where the main earner is non-native speaking German, or people who see their program on the computer outside the 24 hours after the TV broadcast in the media library. This quota, which no longer represents a truly representative cross-section of our population, thus becomes an almost impenetrable bottleneck for TV productions and their makers with a modern and innovative cosmopolitan approach. This has the effect that predominantly, formats are produced that are tailored to the interests of the voting group, German, old, and male. Unconventional projects that have little chance of prevailing. The creative development of the German television landscape is inhibited, and people who do not promise a positive response to said group are marginalized in the programs. I myself have heard several times that one fears that the ratings of a show with a non-white lead actor would fall into the basement. So, what do the criteria for the AGF sample size mean for Black German film production? What do the regulations say about the institution of German television production and funding? So the AGF uses two methods to choose the sample. One is a random route procedure, and the other is a quota procedure. The random route procedure ensures geographic diversity, while the quota procedure ensures that certain groups are represented. Characteristics such as level of education, age, and sex are taken into account, but missing from the quota are priorities such as ethnic diversity. So it's unclear how the AGF determines whether a person is German speaking. The questions I have are the interviewers required to administer a test? Is the test objective, following the common European framework reference, levels A1 to C1? Is it subjective, allowing pronunciation with a foreign accent to play a role in the interviewer's evaluation? Is a non-German sounding name enough for a family to be eliminated at this random stage? So the language requirement does not in and of itself eliminate people with Migrationshintergrund, migration background, from the sample. It goes without saying that Black Germans are indeed German speaking. The Black community itself is diverse, a realization that prompted the Afro-German organization ISD to change its name from Initiative Black Germans to Initiative Black People in Germany, which includes somebody like me some years ago. Many Black immigrants to Germany speak German, but perhaps as a second, third, fourth, or fifth language. However, and this is the crux, one does not need to prove that they are German speaking before paying the monthly broadcasting fee. And this probably serves a bit of explanation. So in Germany, there is a monthly broadcasting fee, which everybody has to pay. You can't get around it. If you own a television or a radio or a computer, I think even if you're walking around with a smartphone, you have to pay this. So the ARD and ZDF, Deutschland Radio fee, is formerly called the GEZ, secures the financing of public broadcasting. The criteria for mandatory contribution, as I said, it costs around €17.50, so maybe, how much is that in Canadian? It's a lot more in Canadian. So the criteria is simply having a television, radio, or computer in your household. And the broadcasters ARD and ZDF are both members of this AGF Media Research Company. So, and here I just want to say, living in Germany, certain things that are mandatory and regulations, it's really hard normally to navigate if you're not a German speaker. However, the information for the fact that it's mandatory to pay this 20 bucks is in so many languages. Look at this accessibility. We've got English, French, Espanol. I mean, there's no way that you can use the excuse that you're not German speaking to get out of paying this 20 bucks every month. So, as the situation stands, a household with a family that is not considered German speaking is forced to contribute to a system that is unlikely to represent their point of view. So similar to the situation Medhondo describes, these communities are unknowingly co-producing a cultural system that systematically ignores their point of view. Medhondo refers to a system that labors for specific exclusion through perpetuating a set of cultural codes that project the African and Arab as other. Quote, "This alienation disseminated through the image becomes all the more dangerous for being insidious, uncontroversial, accepted, and seemingly inoffensive and neutral," end quote. So Ricketts, in speaking about the AGF requirements for the sample size, he makes the jump, as you heard, from German speaking to mother speaking German, Muttersprachliche Deutsch, and then to white, male, and old. And this is his personal experience as a producer and filmmaker in Germany and abroad, and informs his reading of these cultural codes. Now, there are many assumptions built into the AGF requirements. First, that non-German speaking people in Germany do not watch TV. Second, that the viewing habits of non-German speaking people in Germany does not provide information that would be valuable to broadcasters and producers. 3, households in Germany where the breadwinner is not German speaking do not have other German speaking members in the household. And finally, if households in Germany where the breadwinner is not German speaking do have other German speaking members in the household, that their viewing habits are somehow inconsequential. So let's break these down. First, this assumes that German television realm is a safe space for producers to represent non-German speaking characters, and without them seeing, and more importantly, without them being able to critique these portrayals. Perhaps this is an example or an explanation for the racist portrayals that pop up time and time again in German film and television, especially on Tatort, the false confidence that they are not watching. And so the second one, I mean, if non-German speakers are watching German television, and they are, then their choices about what they watch would be only valuable information for a broadcaster that is interested in being inclusive. And for 3 and 4, these two assumptions for me connect integration to a mastery of the German language in an effort to ignore families where members have Migrationshintergrund. It ignores not only first-generation Germans, but the second generation as well. So again, the German Federal Statistics Office indicates that there are 18.6 million, or over 22% of the country's population of 82 million, are first or second generation immigrants. So it is irrelevant if a Black German person speaks German perfectly. By virtue of their skin color, and I think this goes towards what Daniel was saying, by virtue of their skin color and the racism in Germany, they and their stories they tell will be deemed foreign. Hondo describes the participation of Africans and Arabs in the telling of their own stories as sovereign peoples, a responsibility. Producing for Black German filmmakers means community engagement, lobby work, and education. And Sherry Hagen yesterday is so very much involved in all of that. Unfortunately, constantly having to defend the right to author our own stories is part of what producing is for us. Ricketts insists that digital platforms provide a diverse audience for Black authored films, but it's questionable whether they will also provide funding, at least in Germany. The AGF recently paired up with an international marketing research company, Nielsen, to begin collecting data on video streaming. And while the sample size is much larger than what the AGF uses, so instead of 5,000, that sample is 15,000, the German-speaking requirement remains. However, thinking transnationally may very well be the way forward for Black German filmmakers, and I mean, this would be a whole other paper, but the recent blockbuster success of Black Panther, which is a German co-production, demonstrates that Black authorship is marketable and profitable. And this is an image from Each One Teach One's Black-only screening in Berlin for the premiere of Black Panther just in February. So in conclusion, both Hondo and Ricketts wrote their essays to coincide with a major turning point in their filmmaking careers. Hondo was making history with West Indies, and Ricketts was returning to Europe after a successful stint abroad. Each saw fit to reach out to their communities during this milestone and take a survey of the conditions of production for Black-authored cinema and television. Producing for us, in all of our diversity, involves creative workarounds to a funding system prejudiced against us, community support, and exhaustive lobby work. In the absence of Black filmmakers telling our own stories in the German media, mirrors some of the predicaments Hondo described in the African continent some 30 years ago. Ricketts' summation of the situation illustrates that Black and other voices are not considered important in terms of spectatorship, and that marginalizes the same voices on the production side. The horse is itself a machine, and we cannot replace it with a new one until it is in the interest of German institutions to make structural change. Change starts by asking everyone in Germany what images they want to see on their screens. Thank you.
We have lots of time for questions and conversation. I'm going to pass the mic right along because I don't have to speak, which is a good thing.
I mean, I want to be very careful saying that because I'm sure that that's not true all the time, everywhere. But I think there's this way in which we think about, I mean, the question is sort of, because Blackness is so clear in the US imagination, and I wouldn't say it's not in the German, but that it's sort of like nobody is going to ask that question. And I think what happens in the US is that ethnicity, this is one of the things I wanted to say in the midst of talking about all that but didn't have time to, is that ethnicity is really a kind of a privilege in the United States. Race completely eclipses ethnicity for people of color. And it's interesting that actually being foreign for certain people of color is in fact a way to have more access to whiteness than if you are not foreign. So Mary Waters' work on Black identities in New York City looks at how, the children of African and Caribbean immigrants actually signal their foreignness as a way of distancing from Black Americanness, right? And there's other sort of more traditional sociological scholarship on the first generation, but the first generation Latino, the first generation Black immigrants or children of immigrants tend to do better when it comes to educational and other traditional, measures of upward mobility. So I think there's something really interesting, maybe, and I think it probably comes from the U.S.'s, fake narrative of itself as U.S. as a country of immigration, but that story keeps getting told, right? We're a country of immigration. We are, right? Everyone here came from somewhere except Native Americans, but of course, the history of who was able to come here, there, right? Is quite fractured. So I think it is a less common thing for African, yeah. Right. Right. Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Hi, this question is for Karina. I thought it was really interesting juxtaposition of Tyrone Ricketts and Med Hondo. Med Hondo is such an important figure, so I thought it was a brilliant juxtaposition there. But I do want to ask something about German television, and particularly in relationship to the film we saw last night, At a Second Glance. I'm wondering if that had television broadcast in Germany, and what is your reading of the reception of that film, given the kind of media research issues that you were talking about in your paper? How does a film like At a Second Glance get on German television? How does it produce a larger possibility for Black producers in Germany?
I'm really glad you asked that question because it was something we didn't get into with Sherry Hagen yesterday, but short answer is it doesn't. So Sherry Hagen's film was not financed with television broadcast money, and it took a long time for her to bring it into fruition. She did mention yesterday that she had a very small budget, and what she didn't mention is it was shot, I think, in less than a week. So it was just a testament really to her skill and the skill of the actors, but it is a self-financed film. And this is exactly, I think, what is important to understand when we talk about these types of texts is that they're operating and being created in a way outside of a traditional German system. And this is why it's very interesting to look at also at models in terms of web TV and transnational models for creating films that then reflect these voices.
Another issue is this balance between access and intellectual property rights. And Sherry Hagen's film is on Vimeo. You can see it for $2, but other things aren't available. And so what's the discussion about that? I mean, people should be rewarded for their work, but then you put things up out there and then you're not getting that reward. So what kind of discussion is happening about that? And I'm thinking actually of Bronwyn Okpako, whose films are very inaccessible and very hard to get. And if you want to get them for your library or if you want to buy them, it's very expensive. And so how do you work with that?
That's interesting. I'm going to try and interpret your question. They are two different financing models. Maybe that has something to do with it, because Bronwyn, she did have a 3-film deal with, I think it was also ZDF, to make her Kleine Fernsehspiel, genau, to make her 3 films. So maybe that is why it doesn't have as wide access as somebody who's an independent producer and has all the rights and is able to say, okay, I'm going to use these alternative distribution models. But in terms of reward, if you mean financial reward, definitely. And another one of the texts that I look at is Emilia Umuhire's Polyglot. And I'm always asking her, when are we going to see the fourth episode of Polyglot? And she says, we're not, because she made it all, for free, bartering. It's a beautiful series, but it's not able to sustain her, so it ends there. Yeah.
Question for Daniel. I noticed that you're talking a lot about African American experiences and just considering the way that African American identity dominates the African diaspora. I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about that and how you're negotiating that in your work.
Yeah, let's see. When you say negotiate, do you mean me, myself, as African American, or do you mean how do I negotiate that particular narrative, and how do I work with it in the questions I ask and interpreting their responses? Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Right. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah, I actually am, I'm interested in that and concerned about that. And I think some other scholars have done that kind of work on, say, France, for instance, right, and the sort of Black American presence in France. I mean, at the moment, that was sort of where, and I think it was in the title of that slide was, you know, the question of global or American Blackness, right? And, you know, why is this the go-to, you know? And I suppose even a very simple question is, why is so much of the global Black identity articulated in English, right? Why is it that racial profiling is said as in English in Germany and not often rassistische Polizeikontrolle, which I've started to hear. So I haven't like systematically looked at that, but I do think that, so I mean, I guess my attempt is actually, what I'm actually trying to do is to pull apart global Blackness and to find out what it actually looks like underneath, because I am suspicious, and to all that I know so far, there is a clear African-American hegemony within that, right, in which sort of Black American is kind of on the top of this heap of Blackness, right, where the rest of, and there's a romanticization of it. I mean, one of my early experiences in living in Germany as a person who identifies as mixed race and Black was always that being thought of as not Black enough for people in Germany, right, because I wasn't characteristically enough like the people that they had seen on television, right? And I heard that from some Black Austrians as well, not the person I interviewed here, but a long time ago when I was on the Lonely Planet Thorntree, and I talked to somebody who was Black Austrian, you know, she said, oh, we were so disappointed that you were so light, right, light-skinned. So I mean, there's a little personal anecdote here, but I do think that there's something very problematic in the way that this move towards being globally Black means being African American. So I'm concerned with it, and I'm not sure how to exactly address it yet with what I have so far, but thanks for the question, it's great.
I just want to comment, Daniel, that when people ask you that in the United States, they ask you, who are you, as opposed to where you're from. Different reframing of the question. But the question I have is about the person who called herself Micheling.
Mm-hmm.
And did doing that, I mean, in the United States, you know, the issue of trying to reframe the N-word, I'm not so sure how successful that's been. So I was wondering if reframing Micheling has been very successful in Germany.
Yeah, I think that's a conversation we'd have to have in a larger group, I hope, because I think others can talk more about that term. But she was an interesting interviewee in the sense that so I did my interviews at the Bundestreffen, the Black community meeting. I should have said that just to be a little bit more, you know. So I mean, this was a select group of people over a short period of time. And, you know, this particular person actually said in one of the meetings, well, I feel like I'm different because I'm mixed. And some other people disagreed and said, no, you know, there will be no colorism here at this meeting. And I think I understood that position, but I think that she was, in the interview, other things that she said clearly showed that she saw herself as in solidarity with other Black people, right? That she wasn't trying to engage in a kind of like whiter than competition. So it could be that she's trying to reclaim it that way, but my sense is that it's kind of a little bit naive on her part, right? That she's just doing it because she does feel mixed and she doesn't have a word for it. And instead of using the English word or saying, I'm mixed, you know, ich bin mixed or something, she's trying to just use a German word and redefine it. And I like your analogy of you know, the N-word as a reclaiming of it, but I'm not so sure. I'm a little skeptical. But she was, she was in solidarity with other Black people, which was part of the questions that I also asked. So, yeah.
My question is for Sylvia. got that right? Yes. It has to do with, maybe you could elaborate a little bit on the idea of the mobile self. I was very interested in your paper because I've had different travels but haven't reflected on them in that lens. And I just wondered, is it different for people who are not an artist to have that sense of mobile self? What would that be?
To the last bit of the being an artist, I think today in this world, if you are an artist, it's just it's part of your life is to be mobile, not only because you want to, but also because you have to, because you depend on scholarships. And for example, Oksana, she told me a few days ago that if you wanna stay as a dancer only in Berlin, well, that would be really difficult to have to really find a permanent job there. So mobility is kind of necessity also. That's sometimes good and sometimes not so good. But what I meant with the mobile self is I was also thinking about there's an anthropologist from Australia, Gassan Haig, and he develops on the self as and he develops on the idea of existential mobility, and that for example he analyzed Lebanese migration Lebanese international migration, and reflects on the idea that the migration comes because people feel that they are existentially immobile, that they are not able to move forward, and that so geographical mobility comes after that. And in the case of Oksana, for example, I think that it goes together, that for herself, she really understands herself as not being stick to one place, but to live in different places, and work in different places and with different people. Thanks for the question.
I have a question, but also an observation from a couple of the last questions and responses. One having to do with an observation that in all of your presentations, and particularly that having to do with the film industry and also being mobile, the mobility issue and also that of access, and the underlying financial issues that come into play, being a part of a system and being outside of a system, and how much empowerment comes when you can connect to those outside of the system to develop your own system of being able to become mobile. And that's kind of in and of itself, a kind of a cyclical or global idea. And the thinking out of the box that Jen Hagen mentioned last night, how important that also is in the visibility of the work that people are doing and getting it out there. We're struck by the fact that in the question behind about access to the films and things that we want to use in if we're teaching or if we're presenting, that we want to use in our presentations and things, and how difficult they are to access. The point about, I wanted to ask Daniel and anyone else who'd like to respond to that. I am 7 decades of African American, and the 10th grade started to learn German and spent time in Germany. Going along at that time when I went back as a student, what I found was most Germans would ask me where I was from, but they would never guess the United States. I used to have I'm Native American too, so I had very long hair, and I even had an oma and an opa look into the window of a store one day when I was looking in it with a hood on with fur around it because it was cold, to say, Oma, ein Eskimo ist das. So things of that nature bringing to the fore that, in fact, you're different, but it also had to do with levels of your skin color and appearance, your hairstyle, all of those things. My thought and my question to you is, in the thinking that African Americans somehow seem to, the African American story dominates the whole question of the diaspora. I'm president and founder of the Georgiana Simpson Society for German Diaspora Studies. And in that, the idea of Georgiana Simpson, who at that time was even a name that was kind of unfamiliar to me, turned out to be the first African American woman in 1921, the year of my father's birth, to get a German philology degree from the University of Chicago. at a time when she was not allowed to live in the residencies on campus in order to get that degree. She found ways around that, and she got the degree. Today, the bust of Georgiana Simpson stands in a hall that is directly across from a plaque that is the norm to encapsulate the lives of former administrators. And she faces the very one who denied her the right to live in the residence. Those kinds of statements come out of our history. And because of the history, that coming all the way back from the Middle Passage and slavery, do you find in your studies that the history is the thread, that perhaps that and the fact that our history has been made so public, even though growing up in the days of segregation, there was very little that one could find about slavery in any history book. We took ownership at some point to tell our stories or to live them out and to exalt those people who were our scholars. We found in the founding of the work that we've been doing, this is my colleague, Dr. Hodges, that our group has found we have an enormous connection to a legacy of transatlantic legacy of African Americans in Germany in scholarship, Du Bois, Carter Woodson, and many others. And so I would say to ask you, do you find that that may very well be part of the answer to why it is that we are being held, as you say, maybe at the top of the heap? I've had students who come from the Caribbean, and in an exercise that we do to get away from where are you from, they will say, I am, and the question is, I am, but I am not. And they began to say now, I am from Mauritania, I am West Indian, but I am not African American. So even in making that distinction, it says a lot about how people are trying to get to where they can tell their own stories and be visible. So I'm asking you, do you find that perhaps that is part and part the answer, that our part of the diaspora has been out there a whole lot longer, and we've experienced so many of the things that other people trying to empower themselves have experienced?
You said a lot there. It's a wonderful question. I appreciate the history that I didn't know. I'm not sure. I think that there's a whole history of African Americans in Europe that is. I mean, there's endless history there that I'm unfamiliar with. I know of Du Bois, of course, and others, Carter Woodson, and so on. But I feel that in the current moment, most of that dominance, if you will, is about the circulation of images of African Americans, right, and what's happening in America. And I would suspect that some of it also has to do with those ways, the way the state ideologies of race. So I came to this because in figuring out my dissertation project, I almost ended up studying Brazil. That's why I keep making references to Brazil. I didn't speak enough Portuguese, so I ended up in Germany instead. But you know, Brazilians went through this too in the 1970s even, when they embraced Black power, right? And so there's this whole, I mean, that played out in Brazilian music. There was a whole, you know, samba soul scene that happened in the 1970s, and they were watching blaxploitation films, they were watching Shaft, they were watching Superfly, and taking on this Black American identity, because the only thing they had ever been given was samba, football, and you know, blacks as, you know, serving sort of this white Brazilian interest. And so I think that's what propelled people. I mean, I still think that plays a role somewhere in the midst of this. So I certainly wouldn't challenge any of the points you're making about that history, but I also wonder if the US's place in the global economy and in the global system of states is also not part of that story, right? I mean, Brazil is 200 million people. If you count the Browns in, there's 100 million people of Black people in Brazil, 100 million, right? And in the United States, we're 40 million, right? So, and so, I mean, why are we, you know, Nigeria has 130 million people. Why are we at the top of this? The only other thing I would throw in would be that I think that, lost my train of thought. I know what it was. It's that there are actually, it seems to me that there are remarkably fewer African Americans who seek out the Black diaspora in the same way that there would be people in the Black diaspora seeking out Black America, right? And there are very notable and important exceptions, right, to that. And, you know, so it's, And of course, the structural inequality globally helps that to happen, right? Because why should we? I mean, because America doesn't look to the rest of the world in general. So why should Black America be different? There are important exceptions, right? African Americans who were communists and Marxists and went to Russia, other expatriates, certainly those movements back to Africa and so on, and Black cosmopolitans and so on. But I'm not sure. So that's the best I can answer. Yeah.
Okay, I actually was going to say a lot of what you've already said in this question of the dominance of African American in the discussion on global race. And I think, not to be redundant, but you have to think about the United States and its dominance globally. I think that's the biggest thing. The other part of it, I think, is very important. My colleague here, who talks about the presence of African Americans in Europe. When I was in Germany in the 1980s, fact of the matter was, because of the Allied occupation of West Germany, Germans had to learn English. There were so many books that were translated, especially in terms of Black writers. It was just unbelievable. I could go into a Kneipe somewhere and I'd meet someone and they want to have a conversation with me about Chester Himes. So the American presence globally has a lot to do with also the African American presence in the race discussion, and also the kind of leadership that was taken in the community against racism. And I also want to iterate that those folks, beginning with Du Bois, Baldwin, whomever, they never limited that discussion just to Black Americans. They were addressing international issues. That struggle was viewed as being liberation for Black people throughout the world. But the way people perceive it, of course, in Germany, they're going to go to English because that's their second language largely, and depending on the age of the Germans. So I just wanted to reiterate and reinforce what you've been speaking to here already.
If it's easy, I would like that. Yeah. Hi, I'm Michelle. I guess we couldn't put ours in as we go because I don't think they were ready to load it all up. Is this your presentation? Is this your stick? Yeah. Yeah, of course, no problem. Yeah, I'm Michelle. Hi. Nice to meet you. I am freezing in here. I apologize for the ice cube hand. Yeah, we can load them up because I want to use the clicker and I want to be able to move around. So here's a question. Would you mind taking a couple photos for me? I took some photos of you when you were there, so I can share them. I need those for your portfolio. So when I get up there, yeah, well, I wouldn't mind one, but it's really dark up here. This one's super easy. So basically, I have it with no flash, and it came out completely fine. Okay. So it's set up, and I'm going to show you. You have to look through here. It doesn't show on the screen. Okay. and then you halfway down it focuses, and all the way down it goes.
Okay, yeah,
So
I know that.
have a peek. Just take a picture of these guys randomly. I would love that if you could just, and it doesn't need to be multiple times, like just one that looks good. Is it ready? What do I need to do? Drag it to the desktop?
No,
or?
just whichever one.
I'm going to use the PowerPoint.
Perfect.
Yeah.
That's great. And so what we can do is the
Because
only
I
reason
want to
that
plug
we need
this in, so I need to save this off of this because this is from my clicker. Unless you have USB on this side. Yeah, you do. Perfect.
So the only thing that we're wondering is just about the order, just so that we can figure out like whose PowerPoint presentation that we want to sort of.
Well, I'm listed first. I'd like to go first.
Perfect. Yeah, no problem.
So this is my clicker. I just want to make sure it's working. I'm really bad with this thing. Help me?
Sure.
I just want to see that this is advancing. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Perfect.
that's working. So do I just leave this in?
Yes. So what we can do now is that we'll put up what we call like the dead card, which is like the poster presentation.
Here,
and once you're ready to present, we'll
yeah.
then be
So
able to have your
put your dead card.
Oh no,
your
it's okay.
live
We
card.
do it through.
Okay, yeah, perfect.
So this can be on. So
Oh,
as soon as you're ready to present,
well
we can
then
put it up.
let's just hit play then, so I don't have to fiddle around with it. That would be great. I know. I will leave you.
So the problem we were having with the iPad earlier is interesting. Basically, central router down. We'll try and fix it at launch. The good news is because this
someone's
signal was on screen when it went down.
So
we
microphones.
Still have that signal. Perfect.
Are you looking for a wireless for me?
Yep, we got one
Just
right there.
the handheld?
Yeah,
Okay.
Is that okay?
So once you get that one, they're not on right now.
No, that's fine.
We have
So,
them on
okay.
mute currently. I'll make
Yeah.
sure that one of them is green so that
Okay.
you will be able to.
And if I do want to use this,
that will be on
it would be on.
already.
Okay. I'm really tall.
No, it says.
Well, here's the thing.
It says I was simply.
I know there's not enough holes.
That's what it says.
Okay.
It's the only PowerPoint on there.
Okay, perfect. So what I think we can also do is, if you're comfortable with it, we can also just leave this USB stick here. I would be able to make sort of that easy transition in which once your
There's not
presentation
enough USB ports.
Okay. Yeah, that's the only issue.
Okay, so do that. And can I use the clicker?
You may use my clicker.
Okay.
This is mine. I'm happy to lend it to you because it's so much
You brought your
easier.
own. Yeah, it's
I
so much
did because
easier
I'm
than
like
having
I'm not gonna be like overlooking over here. So.
And is a wireless mic something that you'd be interested in, or are you comfortable with the podium mic?
Whoa.
Or we could have variety. It's your
We'll have
choice.
variety.
Yeah.
Leave them here. We'll
Sure, you
we'll
got it.
rock
Okay.
with it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Now, are you also a photographer?
I'm.
Yes, you can. Okay. So here's what I would love, and then you can.
Okay. Sure. Just the point
halfway
shoot
down.
Yep. That's okay. I don't have a camera quite as good as you, but I do have a
got it.
DSLR,
Okay,
so it
so
will.
you're good.
Yeah.
And then one on my phone.
Sure, no problem.
Okay, perfect.
Perfect. Do we know what time?
Like shortly, 11:15. We were 5 minutes late, so I'm gonna go to the washroom and come right back.
Well, like, we got like another hour and a half. Okay. Okay. Yes. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's fine. Then I can last.
So feel free to say no. That's up. The only other thing I would say is if you do have people coming up with USBs, save their presentation desktop. Save everybody's.
You know what? Yeah, I might
But
actually just start
you're
off with doing
down
that.
here.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Actually, I think I'm going to start with doing that first.
Okay. Which of these was sounding better to you down here?
Mic 5.
5? Okay,
Yeah.
so we'll have that.
Perfect, yeah. Do you want me to turn mic 6
Yeah,
off
let's turn
temporarily?
everything off.
Yeah, you got it. Do we know which, when I say this PC, it going to show up on the desktop currently? Like, I'm wondering.
Yeah, so I would save it to desktop.
Yeah, that one right there.
I think her slideshow is still open, yeah.
Perfect.
Great.
High demand.
Okay.
Great.
Cool. For the afternoon session, I'll bring down our clicker.
Okay.
So that they have the option to use it. But I think we can unplug that one, right?
Yeah, you got it. Or is it 3 presenters again?
Actually, I think it's only these 2.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to
Yeah,
quickly.
of course, no problem.
Go for the next session. So yeah, so part of that, what I was saying was that because the signal is on screen, it's still on screen,
Yeah.
but we can't switch to anything else.
So it's pretty much just desktop to portable, like, or any of, if they have a media file, we can't use anything.
If they have a media file, they have to play it from here.
Right.
I can't play anything from upstairs.
Okay.
So that just means that I'm just like physically closing the dowser.
I did see that
between
you
the
were doing
things.
that. Yeah.
So
Okay.
I can't really switch between anything.
Sure. We're okay. I think at this point, like once we, if it's just these 2 presentations, and what I'm looking at, they seem to be pretty low maintenance. Transition.
We do have.
Yeah, this seems okay.
Thank you. Okay. All right. I'm going to go to the bathroom and I'll be back upstairs. Okay. Thanks.
No worries.
Did you do Mark's too? Yeah, perfect. Okay, I think that's easier. It's saved on there now. Yeah, so you can have your little.
Just wanted to see how this. Right, which is Michelle first, right?
So we, as we said last night, take.
Right. That goes forward, go backward.
Yep.
So, okay.
And just the word of warning, we will be using, if you would choose to use the
Number
wireless
5.
mic like she does, it will be wireless mic number 5.
Yeah.
Because wireless mic number 6, we have had some problems in the past.
Okay.
We do want to make sure that you guys are just
Okay.
maybe as seamless
Yeah,
transition as possible.
I think if this will pick me up fine,
Perfect.
I think I'll be okay. Oh, yeah, I know.
You got it. And just one more thing that I would request is that when you're finished your presentation, I'm actually going to come up and take this mic from you, because what's happened in the past is that if we place it here and he's just going to be speaking on the podium, if this mic is on and this mic is on, there's going to be quite a bit of feedback. So I'm just going to want to make sure that, yeah. Other than that, I think we're okay.
So do you want to pass me that mic then when they call me up, so it's not giving feedback to the guy introducing me?
Of course,
Yes,
yeah, no problem.
Let's do it that way.
Press.
Okay, good morning. Welcome to part 2, Intersectional Canadian Life Narratives. My name is Warren Critchlow. I'm from York University. Our first speaker will be Michelle Newton. Michelle Newton is an amateur photographer, a pianist, a poet, an influencer, and a freelance writer living in Barrie, Ontario. She is the creator of Our Mosaic Lives, a blog celebrating Black Canadian women. She, on her blog, shares better together outlook on life through articles and reflections, focusing on community events, experiences, and projects. A budding social entrepreneur, Michelle is community-minded in her approach, and she brings together for-profit and nonprofits to impact change through public relations, and she has a firm called PMJ Inc. Michelle holds a Master's of Business Administration and Project Management from Alabaster University, a bachelor's degree in science from Carleton University, and public relations certificate from Ryerson University, and an honors marketing certificate from Algonquin College. Michelle's paper is entitled Better Together Journey. Michelle.
Hello? Good. Okay. So I would loosely call this a paper. It's really a little slideshow that I put together to talk to you about my background and my Better Together journey. I was going to tell you all the things that were just said about who I am, so I won't. I'll skip that. I am many things, but hopefully you'll see that I have often been the only, a token. So whether I was at school, I was the only person who was brown, and I consider myself Black because I was the blackest person in the room. Everywhere that I've worked, I've been the only Black person in a room, in a big organization. At university, I was fitting out and being different because I wasn't Black enough. Someone made reference to that earlier. So again, I found myself to be one of the onlys, and I had first heard the word mulatto, which I believe is actually a mixture of Mexican heritage and white, and I'm like, well, I'm not a mulatto. I'm not a mulatto, and they're like, well, you must be, because that's the only word we can identify you as. So I always felt like I was fitting out, and I'm working on, I guess, finding where I'm from and how that all works. I didn't always know that I was different, though. When I was 5, my family moved to England, and up until that time, I hadn't really noticed that I didn't look like the rest of my family. They were all white, and I'm brown. And this was pointed out to me really rudely by a lot of the school children that I went to school with. They called me a Paki. They didn't seem to, I guess, have another word to describe me, but I was that person. And it made it very difficult for me that year. Now, I was only 5, so I think it's good that I was already somewhat formed as a person, somewhat already had that independent mindedness and confidence. But my mom tells me stories of that year where I could do whatever I wanted because I was Black. Obviously, they clarified at home that I wasn't a Paki, but that I had this difference. So everything at home became a bit of a struggle and a battle. And I think for my family, they were, I guess always prepared for that, but not prepared for that in their 5-year-old. My sister, who was just about half a year old at that time, was also white. So it was a bit of a new time for me. Going forward from that, I guess I would just say that I consider myself a bit of a mosaic. So I'll tell you a bit about my past and how that brings me to be here in terms of being a Black German. My mom is of a Russian-German background. Her family is Mennonites that were in Germany originally, but they were persecuted because they were pacifists, so they had to flee. They fled to Russia. So actually, my mom's dad was born in Russia, but they never identified as Russian. They always identified as German, and then they fled to Poland, and then they came to Canada. And they came in through Pier 21 in Halifax. My mom has been back there, she's retracing her roots, and seen the log and the ledger, and they were given or had access to a farm in Landmark, Manitoba. So my mom was born of this couple, white German couple with this history, and born in Canada on a farm in Manitoba. She was a Mennonite and went to practice, I guess, preaching that word or being involved in the community in Oklahoma. And there she met my dad, a Black American. We're not in connection with this person, so I don't know what the African American roots are, but I do know that my dad was a Black American. So I put this on as somewhere in Africa and some American. So talking about being transnational, because my Black American father isn't part of my life, my mom met and married a British guy, also white. So as you can see from this photo, I had a little sister who's white, my dad's white, my mom's white, and I'm brown, which is known as Black to me. And my dad raised me as his own. That's the only dad I know. But hey, I had an all-white upbringing. So when I was thinking about this from a German perspective, there's a lot of German traditions, because I would have to say that until recently, I wouldn't have called myself a Black German. But hey, I eat Raukuchen with watermelon. We make German pancakes. We have a whole bunch of German traditions, and Pascha, the never-ending Easter bread. Some of them might even have Russian influences, but I feel like I've passed on these German things. My mom spoke German. I didn't learn German, but we do have some words that I understand. On the British side, well, I do bird watching, train spotting, and I drink tea, and I did a biology degree because I love bird watching. So it was very influential. But again, in this environment that I was blending different cultures and different nationalities, I was the only. I had the fortune of meeting somebody in my world, and it's funny because he came from this sort of same community that I grew up in Newfoundland. We moved to Newfoundland when I was in grade 6. I had a very interesting experience there, being an only. One day, for some reason on the bus, a bunch of students decided they had an issue with me, and I was spit on. So I just hunched down in my seat, and I think I remember it more talking about it than I remember the action. And I ended up staying on the bus till it got to the end, and then I guess my mom was like, "Where is my kid? What's going on?" So anyways, they found out that I had been on the bus and I had been mistreated, and the only thing they could say was it because I was Black. So the principal, and again, I think, ignorance, well-meaning, but very damaging, I think, had the whole school had it. He went class to class. What would it be like if you were the only white person in a whole school of Black people? It didn't help the situation, but I think that he was doing something to try to recognize that you could feel different and you could be treated differently, and he felt everyone should be treated the same. So yeah, all white upbringing, very interesting times. So somewhere in Newfoundland, not far from me, was a man who was also a transnational. He was being raised by a French father from St. Pierre-et-Miquelon, and a mother who was Canadian in Newfoundland, which was its own country for some time up until '49. And his name is Pierre. Guess what he had? An all-white upbringing. And I put the French baguette because his father is very French, so he had this sort of French. He learned French. They went to France for a couple of years to live, where he struggled a lot being Black, so he's adopted into a white-only family. His brother is also of mixed race, not brothers genetically, adopted. Anyway, so I wanted to bring that in because I feel like we found each other. Is it meant to be? Do we have a shared heritage and an understanding of being of different races in one and being considered Black as a mixed person? Yes, we do. So I think for me, that's the first time that I felt that I lived an identity that had Blackness. Now, he also didn't listen to jazz music growing up. He didn't do things that, funnily enough, we resonate with. It wasn't like we're like, hey, we're both Black, let's get jazz albums, let's start listening to them. But it just came, like I heard the music, and it moved me. I play instruments. I learned classical music. What would you learn on CBC Classical Radio? Classical music. Now I play jazz piano. It's just in there, and we were able to have that experience. So when we had our child together, it makes you think. And I know she looks very fair there, but hey, she is a brown baby. She's a product of these brown people. In this picture I wanted to just share, there's, my German heritage mom with me and the baby, and, we're still sharing this life. Don't know if I had showed that. So that's our little family photo that we took. So, I mean, it's sort of here's a family of like people. For my husband, it was the first time that he had met a blood relative, was when our baby was born. He doesn't know his family. My mom is my mom, my birth mom. I don't know my birth father, but at least I felt like I have a connection to my roots. So I'm on some type of a journey now, you know, trying to understand. I know a bit about this German side. I know a little bit about our history and coming over at Pier 21 and how hard that was for my mom in the 60s to be pregnant with a black child. Her German parents wanted nothing to do with her. She ended up going to an aunt and uncle in Hamilton to have that baby, which was me, and to be part of that. So it's just trying to understand, you know, that side I have a perspective. The other side, not so much. So if you want to talk about transnational, here's a kid that I think there's an opportunity for us to explore our own roots through her, because on the one side, she's got this African-American, Canadian firstborn with a German-Russian background. That's all coming through me as a Canadian of second generation. And on the other side, you've got her dad, who has got Barbadian and Canadian from a French-Canadian mom who he doesn't know, but also some French influences from his immediate family. So I feel like I've just come to a point with my daughter and just growing older where I call it going back to black. I don't know, I like Amy Winehouse, I guess. But it's become a place for me to realize that I need to explore some other parts of me, and it's not just playing jazz music. It started when I was looking around here in Canada at Black History Month. I live in Barrie. It's about 40 minutes north of Toronto. So if you've walked around Toronto, you say, hey, it's very multicultural. There's a lot of races and ethnicities here. Go to Barrie, nothing. It's pretty plain. So come February in Black History Month, each year I kind of, since I've had my daughter, because it's only been recognized in Canada for 10 years, officially Black History Month. I'm like, where is anything going on for Black History Month? Nothing's happening. And it really, I couldn't tell if I was annoyed about it or okay about it, because the white side of me is like, whatever. The black side of me is like, what? So I really felt like I wanted to celebrate and talk to other black women and find out, am I alone in this feeling? What are you experiencing? So it was mentioned earlier, I launched a blog called Our Mosaic Lives, and really a personal project for me, but it is turning into something more. I interviewed 7 women. I hadn't met them before. They were referred to me, and talked to them like, what do you think? Should there be Black History Month? Does it matter to you? And then I was like, while you're here, who were your role models? Because I grew up with no role models of color. None, and we weren't media people, so we didn't have TV on. I had nothing. And I found some interesting conversations there. And who are your mentors and role models today? And what are you trying to help your children look to the future with? So I was able to ask these women these questions, and it helps me understand me. And it helped them understand themselves as well. So I feel like it's a journey of seeking to be understood, but also seeking to understand and really wanting to have that feeling with others. So in kind of my conclusions of what I've done in this work so far, and I'm doing a next series called Our Views on Success, because I want to know why sometimes I don't feel successful, and people are like, oh, you got an MBA and a BSc and a thing, and you got a great daughter. Why am I questioning this? So by exploring that with other people who are similar to me in some ways, maybe I can uncover some of that. And I can also help my daughter, who's 12, go forward in her life feeling like, oh, I am achieving success, and it can be this, and it can mean different things. But my main point of this globe slide is just that I felt that together we are better, and it's really just this one world, and we're all trying to figure out how to navigate it and how to live together in it. I put this up because this is my friend's daughter in Barrie, like I mentioned. Actually, she's in Innisfil. Sorry, she's in Innisfil. Innisfil's more diverse, yes. And again, so she is somebody that I talk to try to connect to on my Better Together journey, so that maybe her daughter can look to the future as well, kind of going, yeah, I might be the only, but understanding where we fit in this. This is just kind of the last quote that I wanted to put out there, is that I feel like our strength lies in our differences rather than trying to, you know, whitewash ourselves and straighten our hair. And, you know, I'm really even examining, I worked in corporate world for a long time, wearing suits and things like that, that I don't think that that's me. So coming here today, I had a dress on earlier with heels, and I thought, you know what? That's a different person than I have become over the last little while of turning 50 years old and exploring some of these things with other women. And I want to be able to be me. And I don't care if you don't like these shoes. It's me. I'm okay with it. So just the idea of, you know, being together and celebrating those differences as a strength, as a community. So that's just a little bit about me. I have this little hashtag. I've had it on my license plate for a long time, and originally it started because of having my daughter and realizing that the three of us were the same and we're better together. But I think it has broader implications. And there's my timer. Okay, I'm done. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Michelle. That was an intriguing presentation, and I see that you and your daughter share a significant interest in that leopard skin design there, and your blouse choice, and so on. Okay, our next speaker is Mark Morrison Reed, the Reverend Dr. Mark Morrison Reed, I should say. He earned his master's degree at the University of Chicago in 1977 and his Doctor of Ministry at Medville Lombard Theological School in 1979. He served as minister to congregations in Rochester, New York, and Toronto, Canada, before becoming an allied affiliated faculty at Medville Lombard Theological School and coordinator of its Sankofa collection, the focus of which is people of the global majority who were Unitarian Universalists. He has also served as president of the Canadian Unitarian Council and president of Family Services Association of Metropolitan Toronto. Dr. Morrison Reed is primarily recognized as a historian of the African American experience within Unitarian Universalism. He has published widely, including his 2008 memoir, In Between, a memoir of an integration baby, which I think is available outside. He will soon publish a new book revisiting the empowerment controversy, Black Power and Unitarian Universalism, which should be out this month or next month at least. Speaking of transnational perspectives, Dr. Morrison Reed embodies an international experience or international experiences. He moved to Switzerland with his family in 1962 when his father spent a sabbatical year at the University of Bern. His family returned to Chicago a year later, but he remained until 1965. Revisiting Switzerland in 1971, he stayed and later moved to Austria before returning to Chicago in 1974. In 1987, he spent a sabbatical year in Switzerland, and in 1988, he moved with his wife and co-minister and their two children to Toronto. So since 1993, at least, he's held dual citizenship in the US and Canada. Dr. Morrison Reed.
There we go. Thank you. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to. So most of the story is going to be the preliminary to arriving here in 1998. So this is kind of how I ended up here. Though I won't talk much about him being in Canada. And I don't get to talk about this much. I do lots of other stuff. I talk about other people's history, but this piece of my life that I'm going to unpack is one I don't get to unpack that often. So James Baldwin is mostly exclusively, but not exclusively, associated with Harlem and Paris and France. However, in 1951 and 52 and 53, he made three visits, we might say retreat, to Leukerbad. Leukebad. It's located in the Upper Valais in southwest Switzerland. There he wrote an essay. It was entitled Stranger in the Village. It appeared in Harper's Magazine, October 1953, and later in the collection Notes of a Native Son. You may have seen it there. He wrote this: "From all available evidence, no black man had ever set foot in this tiny Swiss village. I remained as much a stranger today as I was the first day I arrived, and the children shouted, 'Nega, nega,' as I walked along the street. Some thought my hair was the color of tar, that it was the texture of wire or a texture of cotton. It was jocularly suggested that I might let it grow long and make myself a winter coat. If I sat in the sun more than 5 minutes, some daring creature would come along and gingerly put his finger on my hair as though he was afraid of an electric shock, or put his hand on my hand, astonished that the color did not rub off. In all this, in which I must concede there was a charm of genuine wonder, there was no suggestion that I was human. I was simply a living wonder." Around the time that The Stranger in the Village was published, Vincent O. Carter arrived in Bern. Born and raised in Kansas City, Carter enlisted, having lied about his age, and fought in France. Set on becoming a writer, he did what writers were supposed to do, and he returned to Europe in 1953, actually the same year that Chester Himes did, on the same boat on a different voyage, as far as I can tell. His experience in Switzerland paralleled Baldwin's. In his first book, it was entitled The Bern, where we go? Oh, come on. I'm going the wrong way. That's the problem. There he is. Sorry. Was I talking about him and not showing you? Should have stopped me. There we go. The Bern book, a record of the voyage of the mind. It's an odd book. It's not a protest book at all. Actually, it's his musings. He claimed he was the only black man in Bern, capital of Switzerland, which might have been true between 1954 and 57 when he was writing the book. That is, if one doesn't include the people in the Liberian embassy. One chapter bears this title: Everybody, everybody, men, women, children, dogs, cats, and other animals, wild and domestic, looked at me all the time. In July 1962, when I was 13, my family moved to Bern. Our experience mirrored Baldwin's and Carter's. Soon after our arrival, my mother, brother, and I were walking toward the Bahnhof. It's the old Bahnhof, when a man on the other side of Langasse Strasse grabbed his companion's arm, pointed at us, and yelled, "Nigger, nigger!" I froze. My brother clenched his fist, moved to the curb, and said, "Mother, they're calling us niggers." Before he could utter another word or make another move, she grabbed our wrist, dragged us down the block, down Bubenbergplatz. "Stop it," she snapped. "They're saying nega. That's how you say Negro in German. There's no reason to get angry. Control yourselves." "But Mama," I said. I protested. "Hush," she hissed, obeying her protective instinct, a hair-trigger reaction that squashed any move to confront a white man. People are simply surprised to see Negroes. We're exotic, she said. They've never seen people like us before, so get used to it. Getting used to it was hard. It happened constantly on the street, in the trams, in the store, and it made us mad. Children in particular whispered loudly, "Lorganegally." We stared them down. We crossed our eyes. We stuck out our tongues. Adults were nearly as outrageous as the children. They stopped whatever they were doing and stared, mouths open. A few even asked to touch my 3-year-old sister's braided hair, and some simply just reached in to grab her little pigtails without asking. That's the way it was. My brother and I staring at them, staring at us. And I had no idea what they saw, but I saw a stiff, somber people whose formality didn't hide their rudeness. So, how did an African American family of 6 come to be there in 1962? Well, it was unusual, but not unheard of. In 1892, W. Du Bois, we've already talked about. W. Du Bois, the primary, foremost black intellectual and co-founder of the NAACP, 1909, attended the University of Berlin. 1910, Alan Locke, another premier black intellectual of that era, was awarded a fellowship at the Humboldt University of Berlin. I'm not sure when Carter Woodson must have been around that same era. I know that the zoologist Ernest Everett Just was invited to do research at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin in 1929 and made several trips there until 1933 when the National Socialist Party took control. 1929 was the same year that the chemist Percy Julian began work toward a PhD at the University of Vienna. So over the years, my understanding of how my dad came to be awarded the National Science Foundation Fellowship has changed and deepened. Once I would have said if it was just because his colleague in 1961, Fritz Hautermans, director of the Physics Institute at the University of Bern, invited him. Later, I would point back to how it was my father fell in love with chemistry. It was in high school, 1936. Realizing to study chemistry required German, Dad had to find a teacher and recruit the other students because during World War I and the anti-German sentiment, it had been dropped from the curriculum. He went to Dunbar. A more recent revelation of the sorts, and then the research is that Dad's parents, they were both clerks with the federal government, but he grew up hanging around the Howard University campus, where his uncle, a contemporary of Alan Locke's, a contemporary of Georgia Simpson, who Dad may have taken German from, but I asked his brother and he couldn't remember, hung around with, was running buddies with Mordecai Johnson Jr., the son of the first African-American president of Howard University. What that meant was they had the run of the campus. They could do what they want. They had programs for them. But in that context, my dad had role models that left him to believe it was possible to become a scientist, something that was otherwise unimaginable in 1930s Jim Crow America. During the 1950s, Dad, a nuclear chemist who'd worked on the atomic bomb on the Manhattan Project, began traveling to conferences around America and in Europe. One hot summer, on their way home from a conference, a Thing with Gordon conference in New Hampshire, a colleague asked my dad why he was wearing a suit and tie, sport coat and tie, and Dad replied, "I have to." Dad said, "I was an ink spot," was the way Dad described himself. So via osmosis, I took all of this in. Fall 1971, age 22, I flew to Ireland to work on a project with a dozen Euro-American buddies from my college, Beloit College. I wore a sport coat, turtleneck. They wore sweatshirts. Approaching the passport control, I actually rushed ahead to separate myself from them, that rabble. I sailed right through. They all were stopped and questioned. I knew better. Months later, I returned to Switzerland and stayed until 1973. Arriving in Switzerland, I felt this kind of the there's a wariness, there's a tension I always feel, but there it melted away. You know, I'd always taken it in from my father and his brothers and others that Europe was simply a safer place if you were black. Yes, of course, there were awkward situations, but there were never life-threatening ones. Yet I quickly learned of the anti-immigration party, Vigilance in Geneva, and James Schwarzenbach, and his xenophobic rantings in German-speaking Switzerland, part of Switzerland. A referendum on Überfremdung lost. That's kind of the foreign invasion. Überfremdung lost while it was aimed largely back then at Italians and Yugoslavs. I could sense Switzerland was becoming less hospitable place for people like me. There we go. Carter was still living in Bern when I was back that time. The Bern book had come out a year earlier, although I did not discover it until years later. In hindsight, I'm sorry I never met him. His partner, who Warren's met as well, Lisa Lott, told me I would have liked him, and I have many questions I would have liked to have asked Carter. The Barron book opens with Carter sitting in the Café du Commerce and when someone asks a question he most dreads, this is the question: how did you come to live in Bern? It's a loaded question. He usually tried to absent himself when it was asked. The question, it really doesn't interest me. What I wanted to know is what he was looking for that led him to remain all those years. See, I faced that question myself in '73. My Swiss friends peppered me with questions when I talked about going back to the US. They said, well, what about Vietnam? What about Watergate? Isn't Nixon a crook? Why would you go back? And I wrestled with that, and I wrestled with it, and not to remain or not, sensing I would never be more than an oddity, at least that's what it felt to me there in Switzerland, and that I had responsibilities best met in the US, I returned in 1974. Carter spent the rest of his life in Bern. He died in 1984. In March 1987, I returned with my own family to spend 6 months in Switzerland. Weeks later, on May, I guess it was the Monday, April 6 headlines in the International Tribune were this: Swiss vote to tighten refugee law. The vote approved a federal referendum that enables the Swiss Bundesrat to tighten restrictions on refugees and to make political asylum more difficult to obtain. Although both the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches opposed it, it passed by a margin of 2-1. 17 years earlier, with Schwarzenbach's Überfremdung referendum, had garnered support from 45% of the electorate. Was asylum being abused as the government claimed? Or, as its opponents argued, was the issue skin color and race, since most of the recent refugees were from the Middle East, Asia, and Africa, were not white? I wondered if the vote reflected the natural mindset of a people used to being hemmed in by mountain peaks and remote valleys, terrain that long protected them from the world beyond. Was this the Swiss reaction to a world that could no longer be kept out? Or was something different emerging, something new, provincialism evolving into racism? As I returned to Switzerland and Germany in 1998 and 2003, I saw more and more people of color take up residence. In 2004, I spent time in this tiny village, Bargang. It's north of Bordeaux. During that 2 weeks, I saw one other black person. That was unusual. So it was being stopped by the gendarmerie twice. But it was the week following the Madrid bombing, in which 191 people died. As I have gone almost annually to Germany since 2008, where my son, an engineer with Bosch, and my German-born grandson have lived until literally 3 weeks ago, I came to the realization that I was no longer a curiosity, no longer simply a living wonder, no longer something exotic. I was rather seen by some or many as a threat and an invader. Last year, a Swiss survey seems to bear some of this out. 1,700 people were asked, with whom would you not like to work? 70% identified Albanians, 66% Middle Easterners, and over half Africans and Turks. When asked if race played a role, only 14% said that made a difference. The author, who's white, I assume, surmised that nationality and religion was more a determinant than race. I'm not sure. Since Jane Baldwin arrived in Leukerbad 67 years ago, much has changed. But whether a living wonder or a threat, what has not changed is the reality of objectification, of not being seen for who one is, nor one's basic humanity affirmed. This is going on the same time that people of color are becoming more deeply integrated into Swiss and German society. I know a group of mixed race, they're all in their 30s now. I've known them since they were infants. First cousins, and that includes among them a web designer, a nurse, an architect, an actress, and an electrical engineer. I was there when he came home from having served for his first time, his first leave from the Swiss Army. But he is Swiss, and I was so proud to be there with him. You know, the one Swiss player in the NBA is mixed race, Thambo Cephaloggia, or whether it's FC Basel or FC Bern or München Bayern or the VfB Stuttgart, every Fußballmannschaft has players of color. You can't find them without players of color, and you can't also find football hooligans who scream AFA. AFA, you know what AFA is? And throw bananas. In Germany, the male vocalist for Ich und Ich, Adel Twal, he was born in Germany. Interesting, in neither of those albums, Ich und Ich or Von Selben Stern, is race mentioned. I was surprised when I went to check. But perhaps rather than be surprised, we should accept this whole reality. That is the discord and the ordinary and mundane, the triumph and the tragic, and that they are normative and they are necessary. Thank you.
Also wonderful content stories. So I'll just open it up to the audience to respond to our speakers. Well, I will ask her. Let me just come been dying to ask Mark Morrison Reed this question. It's true that we have this kind of connection with Vincent Carter. I too have been going to Bern for a number of years. But I've also been teaching Mark Morrison Reed, and there's this wonderful story in a book called Ticking Along with the Swiss. And in this, one of the interesting encounters that he describes in this book is when he was young, 13-year-old or 14-year-old, it was summer, he was taking a sled back to a friend who loaned it to him. It was in the middle of the summer. Here he is with his shorts and looking very Swiss, carrying a sled. And the Swiss were saying, "Oh, well, look at this guy. He's come from Africa. He's looking for snow." So, he doesn't know any better. So Mark tells his story in a very interesting way. And so I wonder if you want to say a bit more about that in relationship to.
But by then, my Swiss German was good enough to at least understood what he was saying, and so I heard this, and I didn't. I said, I gave him the traditional Swiss greeting and kept going. By then, I was laughing all the way across to my friend's house with this, those wood sleds, and then returning it to Ralph. It was but that kind of thing happened you just got used to it, it happened all the time, as Carter said. I have a question for you, Michelle. Do you have a Newfie identity?
So I have been asked this before, why I don't have a Newfoundland accent, because my dad's British. So speaking with a British accent, which he's never lost, and my mom didn't seem to pick up a Newfoundland accent. I can get it when I'm there for like 2 weeks, but it falls away when I come back. Yeah, so in terms of Newfoundland culture, because my family didn't have that in its roots, I didn't inherit any of that. My husband, though, because his mother is from Newfoundland, and he has that, eating the meals that are more traditionally Newfoundland that she made and different things along those lines. But yeah, I guess we're just imports. We're actually called CFAs, which another way, come from away. You can never outlive it. No, you have to be born in Newfoundland, and then I'm not sure if you were brown and born in Newfoundland if you can outlive it. But
my girlfriend, my daughter one of her girlfriends is from a Chinese family, a Chinese restaurant in Newfoundland, but prior to Confederation, 1949. Because it's another culture. It's one other of that part. It's a part of that mosaic. I guess I was gonna.
I think it is in there. I certainly have a love of nature. Living in Newfoundland and growing up, doing all of the outdoor activities there really nurtured the bird watching. That's really big there. So I guess from that perspective, but also just an appreciation for living on the oceans and taking care of the environment that you're in. That's certainly more prevalent in terms of top of mind.
I want to ask Michelle this. To what degree, where you live now, has that your background been a choice as to where you live now, since you have, as an adult, have some choices?
So I always wanted to live somewhere more diverse, and just the way that it worked out, my husband's a military person, and he got moved around against his choice. He didn't have choice in his placement, so he was originally posted in Valcartier. And we didn't move there because I didn't speak French, but he was moved there because he's fluently French. Then he got posted to Barrie. So in essence, the roots of staying in Barrie started with the military experience, and because he's a physician, he's now established a practice and those things. So what we do in terms of conscious choices around living in an environment that doesn't have a large diversity number, so just numerically, Canada is at 2.9% of the population identifies as Black. That number is lower than the Ontario average and the Canadian average in Barrie, so it's very, very small percentage. We send our daughter to a school where there are more visible minorities. It may have its other complications because the people who can afford to send their kids to those schools might also be coming from a white background or it has a socioeconomic difference, but at least in her world, when I asked her about some of my work, she said, but Mom, I'm me. And in a way, I felt that that was good, because in her school, she doesn't feel like anyone is different. I don't know if it's an illusion, but I'm comfortably happy that she's in that environment. But if she was in the public school system, she would be in a school where she'd be the only one. Because there's enough schools where you can spread out the black families, and there's one here, one here. So I go to your point, I would have liked to live somewhere else, and maybe I will in the future, but that's where we are for now.
Thank you both for these just amazing stories, life stories. They're so rich, and I just really enjoyed both of them. I guess I have a question for each of you, but I just wanted to say, Michelle, I loved your point. I think I heard you right in saying that you didn't feel quite like fully a black person until you met your life partner. Did I get that right?
I think
that right?
that I felt like I had been labeled a black person, but I feel like I'm the whitest black person you'll ever meet. So meeting another person who has similarities to me, who would probably himself also say that he's raised in a very white household and feels not connected at all with his black culture, we have an opportunity now to change that course. You know, and I'm actually on part of my journey investigating a little bit more about my birth father, because I feel like that's a piece that is of me, and I know his name, but I've never met him, and I'm 50. So is it a chance to start to bring that into that? And I feel encouraged by my husband to be able to do that, whereas I don't think my family was discouraging me, but I think it was just, if she doesn't mention it, then she's good. And so I don't know what that conversation is going to look like. I have to have that with them now that I'm ready to go down that journey in my black family to meet my father and him to meet his granddaughter. You know? And maybe there are other people that are like me that I would meet. Sorry, that got long. But.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thanks. Mark, I was just wondering about your point that you brought up when you said you felt that it was never, I believe I heard you correctly, that it was never life-threatening being black in Switzerland. And I'm not challenging that, but I was wondering if you could talk more about what that was like to be there as a black person, but not the target of the anti-immigrant party in Switzerland. I know many of us have lived in, outside of our countries where we grew up, and it can be was it a dislocating experience? Was it alienating? Was it strange to be a person of color, African American, in this place where they might have been talking about other people of color? Or just, if you could just talk about what that felt like, or what that was like.
Yes, so the problem when I first got was Italian. I mean, that's from the Swiss vantage point. It was Italians, and then the Yugoslavs, and later the Turks. But it was not aimed at not aimed at black folks, because there just weren't that many. And so I had a little breathing, and it was others. Discomfort, and yet I know it wasn't going to get aimed at me. So that's, and as I went, so I've been back in every decade. I've been significant amount of time in every decade since 1960. You could feel it shifting on the one hand. On the other hand, and I've talked to I was talking about these Swiss kids. They grew up, actually Dad grew up in Chicago, and new friends of mine. He went to, he was 2 years older than I. Their dad became a therapist in Switzerland, was completely fluent in the Swiss German. But they're Swiss. They play football. He's in the Swiss Army. They carry themselves as Swiss. They speak Swiss, and as soon as you see them, you know they're Swiss. And anybody who, they don't get Uberproofed, carded. They don't get carded because it's just obvious. I was with one of them last May, and we were talking. I said, "Well, does this ever happen to you?" He says, "No," but his buddy, who had dreads, pink, and piercings, he got proofed all the time. He got carded all the time, and he was white. So it's not quite. I don't know how to. There are a lot of Swiss. I adopted black children, but that was more than a generation ago. So there are a lot of very, very Swiss people of color who carry themselves like Swiss and feel Swiss. So your stuff is interesting for me. I would be curious to do that with some Swiss, and because in Austria, I would expect is less open. I mean, if you look, they just voted to write its government in. So I would, depending on where you go, I imagine Austria looks different than Germany, East Germany looks different than West Germany, and Switzerland looks different than all of them. That's my intuition.
Hi, I enjoyed both of your presentations, and I was thinking about being black in mostly white spaces, and I thought of two quintessential Americans, one Malcolm X and Barack Obama, who both in periods of their life were in mostly white spaces where they stood out, and Malcolm X was voted the class speaker, and Barack Obama was Barack Obama. So, but my point is, maybe being out of space or being black in a white space is part of the global, maybe not the global, but the black experience in the diaspora. So it is not really such a contra or against what being black means.
Speak to that. So some thoughts on that. I actually recently attended the White Privilege Conference at Ryerson last weekend, and it was an interesting talk about that because within that, existing in that white space, there's also a sort of an overarching, again, the comment someone made about black girls talking too loud, I've heard that. Somebody didn't want to move their office near mine because I was way too loud, and I am just enthusiastic. You know, so I do think, though, that you sometimes, and I mean, I may be speaking only for me, I have to temper some things in that white environment that I'm in. And I think it's so unconscious now because growing up in a white family, I wasn't even aware of it, but down to things like these shoes are not acceptable at the work I used to work at. But now I work for myself, and I'm doing some more projects that are giving me more meaning, and I feel like I'm not going to suddenly throw on a Nigerian outfit because I don't know if that's where my African roots are from, but I feel loosened from that, living in that white environment. And maybe, I don't know, maybe I wasn't really aware of it until recently and it's coming open. So to your point, I think that is what the normal is, but I think that the normal needs to change because I think that in that white environment, a lot of the things that culturally, you know, a colonialistic viewpoint, those are being overlaid onto how I can interact in that environment. And I don't know that that's me.
And I grew up largely white environment. And, but what went with that, coming from black families, I had to be cautious all the time. I wouldn't go out the door without mother reminding me around my behavior standards and my language. And I carried myself. I mean, it was impossible to get out the door without getting a lecture from my mother because she knew I was dealing with white folks all the time. And my kids can tell when I get on the phone immediately if it's someone white or someone black I'm talking to because there's a little switch in the cadence and they know it immediately.
But interestingly, so you being a black male and in a family that is black, I mean, I never had any of those talks. My parents couldn't relate to it at all. You know, and I think that they're being very brave as they watch me going on this journey at, you know, they've had 50 years of quiet and now I'm starting to dig into it. And I think that this is a completely new area. They never thought that I might not naturally have tendencies that are in their environment, but because I'm in there, those are the ones that are nurtured. I mean, why did, you know, my mom got her master's when she was in her 40s, so I got a master's. Like, maybe I never would have done that in a different environment. But I do think, you know, you had those talks because your family could bring that. My parents had no clue about being black. You know, my mom was persecuted for carrying around a baby who was not white and having to learn that. But really, those talks about how do you cope in the world where you're the only, I don't think that we ever had that chat.
So you didn't have the black code, the male black code thing about how you have to be careful.
So did that free me to walk around the world just like they did? Maybe.
Yeah, no.
So I'd like to ask you too to think about some of the points that Daniel made in his paper. So these papers particularly talked about defining yourself as Black vis-a-vis a white environment, but I'm wondering to what degree your notions of Blackness also have to do with either African American culture or with global Blackness, and if that's changed over the course of your life. I'm thinking, for instance, what Daniel said about now the global Black Lives Matter movement and how people are identifying Black as Black in maybe a different way globally.
So I don't really think that I think of myself as Black. And when I look around my home and then I go to a neighbor who is a Jamaican neighbor and I look around their home, they have a Jamaican Black culture infiltrating and being part of their environment. And I look at my home and I don't have anything that I think is identified with any particular Black culture. When I think about the environment, so those of you that may or may not know, there's a talk show host. Her name is Marcy Ian. She used to be on the morning news, and she is Black, and she was pulled over by Toronto police in her own driveway the last time, but pulled over 3 times in the last 8 months. And to me, when I hear about that, I get concerned about, will I get pulled over in Barrie? Will my husband get pulled over? And I think that in that global conversation that you were trying to loop in, I think that that is more awareness of the Black Lives Matter, and there's a group of people that don't like to hear that, and maybe this is how they're responding, and I'm worried about it. I didn't worry as much about that until the last little while, and since the election in the US, I feel more fearful. So is that me identifying as a Black person? I think it is, because if I was just identifying as a white person, I might be upset by it, but not feel fearful.
I have 3 different thoughts. I mean, the problem for me was being born on the University of Chicago campus. I had my dad get his PhD when I was 3, growing up in a white church, going to Europe when I was 13. I had a Black experience, but I didn't have a typical Black experience. And so the expectations for me around Black folks was that I was supposed to have certain attitudes and that I didn't have. And so that was always a tension for me, and I got caught. I couldn't say I had a Swiss boarding school education. I mean, that dropped out of my conversation because I knew as soon as I said it, I'd be labeled as bougie. So I got quite careful both around Black folks and white folks, depending on the information. The situation. So that, and I hide different things from different groups. What I wanted to be was me, was find situations where I could be me, which is transracial. So as a minister, I know the basic questions are spiritual questions that has to do with my essential humanness and my essential sense of being, and how do I get, that's what I think Carter was after, actually. That's what I've come to. He got heavily into arts and very heavily into yoga. Because he was trying to strip off all these identities so he could be his essential self. So I think one actually has to go after one's essential self. And once one finds that essential self with its mosaic of identities, and encompasses and integrates all of those, then you get to be yourself, and I don't have to hide this piece of me or that piece. Except I still have to be cautious, because I was stopped on Roncesvalles. I had dreads down here back then. It was about 10 years ago. I was very clear at that moment. I was responsible for de-escalating it. That I couldn't count on the officer. How to be respectful but direct. And he knew very quickly when he spoke to me that this was a mistake. I think somebody's neighbor had called. I was waiting for some white friends to show up, and they didn't show up. In the middle of this conversation, they showed up. They're all white women. They were pissed, and they chewed him out. And I realized, I told them, we got in afterwards, I couldn't have done that. If I had done what you had done, I'd be in jail now. It was a big lesson for all of us. So there's pieces I can never let go of, and that's one of them. I have to, in those situations, I have to, my job is to get through alive.
That actually brings up this question that I have. I've been reading the Christopher Emdin for White Folks Who Teach in the Hood, and he also talks about sort of blacks who have sort of don't have this mentality of the hood as no longer being black or as thinking like white people. And I guess my question is, to what extent is blackness something that's essential? To what extent, and I think there's no answer to this question, you know, to what extent is it something that is constructed by white dominant sort of culture? To what extent is it part of a mosaic? And I guess then sort of thinking about, you know, it's interesting then that you say that your relatives in Switzerland are Swiss. Does that mean they're no longer black? And I guess this comes back to Daniel's work too, about sort of when one becomes white or black, and to what extent is that a choice, and to what extent is that imposed from the outside? And this is, in gender studies, there's this comfort with talking about, you know, sort of fluidity, and it doesn't seem that that's possible, perhaps because it's not politically possible to talk about it when we're talking about race.
So I've known the kids since they were actually in their mother's womb, but they're not my cousins. But they feel Swiss. But they travel. I mean, they're Swiss and they're not Swiss, if that makes any sense. Because they're in the system, they accept the system, and yet there's a way in which they have one foot outside the system. A colleague, a senior colleague, wanted to write. He was mixed race, grew up in New Hampshire. His dad was a black lawyer, his mother was a secretary. And he talked about protective coloring, that he fit completely into New England society, but his coloring, there's certain assumptions he couldn't make, and he was thankful that he couldn't make them. For him, it was a blessing to be able to stand outside and critique the society. So, oh, and another thing, I'm quite, to bring back to Daniel, I'm really quite curious about, is there a global black consciousness, or will that divide around between people of the diaspora, and that they have a particular consciousness that people say who have remained in the African continent, who actually probably identify local, regionally, as opposed to as Pan-African, though I'm not sure. I'm curious what you find out.
Well, I just have a comment on that, which was one of the things I found out when I was interviewing the 7 black women. Was I had written a draft of one of my interviews, and the woman, I had mentioned her husband as a black man, and she told me, no, he's not black, he's Guyanese. So I don't know if we can have a global blackness if we are all not one. You still have to recognize individual differences, and it is transnational from all these different places. I don't know if you are always going to relate to someone just because you don't fall into the pot of black. It's not homogeneous.
I'm conscious of time. It's 12:45, so we may have one or two more questions, I think.
Just briefly, I wanted to ask, because it's been alluded to but not labeled, and that is the whole idea of one other thing that causes intersectionality across race, and that's class, and how that plays into how you function in the world that you may or may not deem your own. And in being a transnational person, being of the diaspora period, and I believe that we all are people of color, are connected to the diaspora in and of itself globally. Could you speak to that and the role it plays in where you find yourselves perhaps previously, but also at this stage?
I'll start. I'll try to keep it short because I don't want a timeline. So that is an interesting question because I think that when I wrote one of my notes in introducing my parents, and I was going to say that they were students, and I didn't know what to call them. I was going to call them middle-class white students because they were in college at McMaster when I was little. And I think that, it's interesting, though, given that there's a lot of education in my house and that is one of our things that we go for, I actually don't think we've had any really serious conversations about how that's impacted my Blackness, because I don't really know what that looks like. I don't have any model in my life. I had no role models that were Black men or women to look to from any other social class or at all. So I can't speak, I can't speak to that from my own experience, but I think it does have a part. It has to.
So how many people here have done the power shuffle? Have you done the power shuffle? You know what that is? Power shuffle is they say you're white and you step forward, you're Black, you're male, you step forward, woman, you step back, you're queer, you step back, you're heterosexual. So you do this one after the other, and as you go through, some people are going to end up over there, and some people are going to end up back there. You know where I end up on the power shuffle? No, I don't end up back there. I end up there. So I'm quite clear on my class location, and I try and get my daughter. I say, "Hun, you're fourth generation college-educated woman. That's, for an African-American woman, that is almost unheard of." And
that relates to privilege, though, right? Where we all can look at ourselves and look at the privilege we have. So class and the benefits I receive from that, I do view that as being a privilege over somebody who would look like me and not be in that situation. And they may have other privileges that I do not. There's hearing privilege, there's able-bodied privilege. We're all speaking to some of those things in this room. But yeah, it is a privilege.
And the obligation is just to be aware of it.
I'm not sure if I have a question or a comment. I'll begin as a comment, but I'd like to add something to this discussion. I study childhood, and one of the narratives that circulates in that realm is that the Black kids don't do well because they're acting white. I forgot the guy's name, but it's like the biggest theorist that everyone goes to. Yeah, there you go. That Black students don't do well because to do well, they become ostracized as being white. Well, I really don't agree with him. And I don't even agree with kind of a lot of what we're talking about today, and I'll tell you why. I grew up in the military, so I had a similar experience. And yes, I felt different and still feel different if I'm around certain areas, and maybe it is class related. But I think we do ourselves an injustice, too, in this conversation when we sort of say we're not like the other Black people, because I think there's more of us that have had those privileges. They may not look like us, and they may be fourth generation or third generation or military or whatever. I think that yesterday was an example in terms of representation. I think if all you ever see is a certain image of a certain type of African American, and then when you see a different image, the name will not be named, or even in Blackish, where they're now moving up into this, I can't associate with that narrative either. So I think that representation may have something to do with it, so that we change our own language around what it means to be Black and who's Black and how different I am, because I'm not the same kind of Black as somebody else is Black. I think if we really look close, we discover all of us are all different Blacks, whatever that is. And what binds us is exactly what you said, how, and I have just become aware of that part myself, the fear that I have to go into Louis Vuitton the other day. Should I? Should I not? I opted not to. Or the second thought I had when I accidentally went into Starbucks and then realized I shouldn't be in there. But my son worked in Starbucks his whole way through school in a very upscale neighborhood. So I'm just saying that, not that I disagree, but I'm just saying what responsibility do we have and how can we move forward in changing that narrative of what it means to be black and how we opt out because of our different experiences when perhaps as we're discovering more people have those experiences than we think. Does that make a little bit of sense?
Yeah, and some of that I'm trying to do in my blog because I met 7, Black women that live, 15 minutes from me that I didn't know. I've lived there for 12 years. So trying to have those conversations and trying to put it out there. Yes, I mean, if you aren't a Black woman, I probably won't interview you, but that doesn't stop you from reading it and learning that these are normal people. This is what they bring and this is their story.
I thank you so much. This has been a remarkable conversation. Maybe lunch waiting for us, I believe, and maybe it's we need it after this. But I think we should thank Michelle and Mark for this terrific conversation that they've had today.
Can I get a picture of the 3 of us?